The wooden doors of Hollow Trace's church strained against the howling wind as they burst open. Snow swirled into the packed room, momentarily blinding those nearest the entrance. A gunshot cracked through the frigid air. Women screamed, men ducked for cover. In the chaos, Eleanor Foster clutched her youngest child to her chest. The boy's fevered breaths came in short, shallow puffs against her neck. His small body burned through the layers of wool wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the bitter cold sweeping through the church. "Mom," 8-year-old Nathan's cry pierced through the commotion as he struggled against the deputy's grip. Before Eleanor could call out, another officer blocked her path. Nathan fought harder, his small face flushed with anger and fear. "You promised," he shouted, his eyes fixed not on Eleanor but on Wyatt Blackwood. "You promised to protect us." The anguish in her son's voice tore at Eleanor's heart, worse than any physical pain she'd ever endured. Worse than the hunger that had gnawed at her belly during those desperate weeks after Daniel died. Worse than the childbirth that had nearly claimed her life when Michael was born. Then the world spun backward and time began to unravel. 6 months earlier, autumn had painted the Montana landscape in brushstrokes of amber and crimson, but the beauty of the season masked its cruelty. Eleanor Foster felt the first bitter kiss of winter in the wind as she huddled with her children behind Murphy's blacksmith shop. She had chosen this spot carefully. The brick wall retained heat from the forge inside, and the overhanging roof provided some protection from the increasingly frequent snow flurries. More importantly, it was far enough from the main street that respectable folks wouldn't have to acknowledge their presence. "Mama, I'm hungry," Sophie whispered, her 5-year-old voice small against the whistling wind. Her once bright curls hung limp around her hollow cheeks, a testament to how far they had fallen. "I know, sweet pea." Eleanor forced a smile as she adjusted the thin blanket around her daughter's shoulders. "Nathan's going to bring something soon." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She had sent her eldest to check if Widow Jenkins had any kitchen scraps to spare, but she knew the chances were slim. The town had grown weary of their presence, their generosity exhausted. 8 months since Daniel's death in the mine collapse, and Hollow Trace had decided the Foster family had received enough charity. Against her chest, 18-month-old Michael whimpered. His skin burned with fever, and the cough that had started as a mild irritation 3 days ago now rattled deep in his tiny chest. Eleanor pressed her lips to his forehead, her medical training telling her what she refused to admit: without proper care, her baby might not survive the approaching storm. The sound of approaching footsteps made her tense. Nathan appeared around the corner, his thin shoulders hunched against the cold, empty hands jammed into the pockets of his too small coat. "Nothing," Eleanor asked, already knowing the answer from the defeat etched across her son's face. Nathan shook his head, avoiding her eyes. At 8 years old, he had taken on the burdens of a man trying desperately to fill the void left by his father. "Mrs. Jenkins wasn't home," he said, dropping to his knees beside his sister. He wrapped a protective arm around Sophie, though he was shivering himself. "Maybe we could try Mr. Hollister at the bank. Ask for an advance on—" "No." Eleanor cut him off, perhaps too sharply. She softened her tone. "No, sweetheart. Mr. Hollister has made his position clear." 3 weeks ago, she had swallowed her pride and approached the banker about a loan. Hollister had looked her up and down with eyes that lingered too long, then suggested an arrangement that had nothing to do with financial transactions. She had left his office with her dignity intact, but her hopes shattered. Michael coughed again, the force of it shaking his small frame. Eleanor rocked him gently, humming a Cherokee lullaby. Her grandmother had taught her one of the few connections to her heritage she had maintained in public. Behind the closed doors of their former home, she had practiced the healing knowledge passed down through generations. But those remedies required herbs and roots she no longer had access to. The skies darkened as afternoon surrendered to evening. The temperature dropped sharply, and the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, harbingers of the storm that had been threatening all day. Eleanor's heart sank. They couldn't spend another night outdoors, not with Michael burning with fever. But where could they go? The sound of horses and the creak of wagon wheels cut through her desperation. Nathan immediately shifted to shield his siblings, his young face hardening with distrust. Eleanor pressed deeper into the shadows, willing her children to remain quiet. The wagon slowed to a stop. Through a gap in the weathered boards of the blacksmith's barn, Eleanor glimpsed a man climbing down from the driver's seat. Tall, broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate despite the worsening weather. Even in the fading light, she recognized him. Wyatt Blackwood, owner of the Silver Creek Ranch, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, and known to be as cold as the winters he had survived for 45 years. She had never spoken to him, but everyone in Hollow Trace knew his story. How he had returned from the war a decorated officer. How his young wife had died in childbirth 3 years ago, taking their infant son with her. How he had retreated to his ranch afterward, emerging only for necessary business, his once respected presence becoming a shadow that towered over the town. Blackwood paused, his head turning toward their hiding place with unsettling precision. For a breathless moment, Eleanor thought he would move on, pretend he hadn't seen them, as most of the townspeople did now. It was easier to ignore desperation than to acknowledge it. Instead, he approached the barn, his footsteps crunching in the fresh snow, measured and unhurried. "I know you're there," he said, his voice deep and even. Not threatening, but not particularly gentle either. "Come out where I can see you." Eleanor remained frozen, one hand pressing Michael closer to her chest, the other reaching for Nathan, who looked ready to either flee or fight, neither of which would end well against a man of Blackwood's size. The man sighed, his breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. "Your boy is sick. I can hear his breathing from here." Something in his tone, a hint of knowledge of understanding, made Eleanor reconsider. Slowly keeping her children behind her as much as possible, she stepped forward into the fading light. Blackwood's face betrayed nothing as he assessed them. His eyes, gray as the storm clouds gathering overhead, moved from Eleanor's face to Michael's feverish form, then to Nathan's defensive stance and Sophie's frightened expression. "How long has he been like this?" he asked, nodding toward Michael. 3 days, Eleanor answered, surprised by the directness of his question. "The fever worsened this morning." Blackwood's gaze narrowed slightly. "Respiratory infection. He needs warm shelter and proper care." It wasn't a question, but an assessment delivered with the confidence of someone who knew what he was talking about. He glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the huddled family. Something shifted in his expression, so subtle, Eleanor thought she might have imagined it. A softening around the eyes, perhaps, or a slight furrow between his brows. "Get in my wagon now," he said. The words were a command, but there was something beneath them, an urgency that wasn't entirely cold. "Your son won't survive the night out here." Eleanor hesitated. The offer of shelter was tempting, desperately needed, but she had learned to be wary of men's unexpected generosity, especially men with power. Michael convulsed with another coughing fit, this one worse than before. His small body trembled, and when he drew breath, the wheezing sound pierced Eleanor's heart. Blackwood must have seen the fear in her eyes. "Mrs. Foster," he said, using her name for the first time, "I understand your caution, but that child needs care now. My home has heat, food, and dry beds. You can leave at first light if you choose." Nathan tugged at her skirt. "Mama," he whispered. "How does he know our name?" A valid question, but one without immediate importance. Eleanor weighed her options quickly, pride and caution against her son's life. It wasn't really a choice at all. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, drawing herself up as much as possible. "We accept your offer." He nodded once, then turned toward his wagon. "The storm's coming in fast. We need to move." With Nathan's help, Eleanor gathered their meager belongings, a small bundle of clothes, Daniel's worn Bible, and the empty biscuit tin that had once held their emergency funds. Sophie clung to her ragged doll, its once cheerful face now as threadbare as its owner. The wagon was well built, with sturdy sides that blocked some of the wind. Blackwood helped them climb aboard, his hands strong but impersonal, as he lifted Sophie and then assisted Eleanor with Michael. He spread a thick buffalo hide over their laps, more warmth than they had felt in weeks. As the wagon pulled away from town, Eleanor caught sight of faces in windows watching their departure with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. She wondered what rumors would fly through Hollow Trace by morning. What new judgments would be cast upon her family? Nathan sat rigid beside her, his young eyes scanning Blackwood's broad back with suspicion. "We don't need charity," he whispered fiercely, though his body betrayed him, by leaning into the warmth of the buffalo hide. "It's not charity to accept help when it's needed," Eleanor murmured, smoothing his hair. "Remember what your father used to say, a hand up isn't the same as a handout." The mention of Daniel seemed to deflate some of Nathan's resistance. He nodded but remained vigilant, a sentinel protecting what remained of his family. The journey to Silver Creek Ranch took nearly an hour, the wagon moving carefully through the thickening snow. Michael drifted in and out of fevered sleep, while Sophie pressed against Eleanor's side wide-eyed as they left the familiar boundaries of town behind. When they crested the final hill, the ranch spread before them like something from a storybook. The main house stood proud against the gathering darkness, windows glowing with welcoming light. Behind it, a large barn and several outbuildings formed a protective semicircle like a fortress against the wilderness. "It's so big," Sophie whispered in awe. Blackwood guided the horses to a stop near the front porch. Before he could descend, the door swung open and an older woman appeared. Her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Senor Blackwood, you made it back before the worst." The woman's words died as she caught sight of the passengers in the wagon. Her expression shifted from relief to wariness in an instant. "Maria," Blackwood said, his tone leaving no room for questions. "Prepare the blue room. The child is ill." To her credit, Maria recovered quickly. She gave a short nod and disappeared inside her efficient movements, suggesting years of managing unexpected situations. Within minutes, Eleanor found herself ushered into a house warmer and more luxurious than any she had ever entered. The main hall rose 2 stories with a grand staircase curving up to the second floor. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across polished wood floors covered with richly colored rugs. Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have been intimidated by such grandeur. Now she registered only the blessed heat and the promise of safety for her children. Maria led them upstairs to a spacious bedroom decorated in shades of blue and cream. A 4-poster bed dominated the space with a smaller bed near the window and a cradle positioned close to the fireplace. Everything was immaculately clean, as though waiting for guests who had never arrived. "I'll bring hot water and food," Maria said, her accented English clipped but not unkind. Her dark eyes lingered on Michael, and something like understanding passed across her features before she turned to leave. Left alone with her children, Eleanor moved quickly. She settled Michael in the cradle, unwrapping his damp clothes with practiced hands. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing labored. Nathan helped Sophie out of her threadbare coat, then stood awkwardly in the center of the room, looking lost among the fine furnishings. "It's all right," Eleanor assured him, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. "We're safe here for tonight." A knock at the door preceded Blackwood's entrance. He carried a wooden box which he placed on a nearby table. "Medical supplies," he explained at Eleanor's questioning look. "I thought you might need them." Eleanor opened the box to find an assortment of medicines, bandages, and tools far more comprehensive than she would have expected in a private home. She selected a bottle of willow bark extract for Michael's fever. "You're familiar with these?" Blackwood asked, watching her confident movements. "I was a nurse during the war," she replied, measuring drops of the extract into a spoon. "Field hospitals mostly in Virginia and Tennessee." Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Union, no. "Yes." She helped Michael swallow the bitter medicine. "My husband as well, though we didn't meet until after." Blackwood nodded but offered no information about his own service. It wasn't necessary. Everyone knew he had been an officer of some distinction, though he rarely spoke of it. Maria returned with a tray of food, thick soup, fresh bread, and milk for the children. The aroma alone was enough to make Eleanor's stomach clench painfully, reminding her that they had eaten nothing but a few crackers since yesterday. "Eat," Blackwood said, noticing their hesitation. "The boy needs strength to fight the fever." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Mrs. Foster, once the children are settled, I'd like to speak with you downstairs." It wasn't a request, despite the polite phrasing. Eleanor nodded, a flicker of apprehension returning. What would he want in exchange for his hospitality? "Nathan, help your sister," she instructed once Blackwood had gone. "Make sure you both eat." Nathan's expression said he wanted to argue, to insist on coming with her, but years of responsibility had taught him when to push and when to obey. He nodded, taking the role of caretaker, while Eleanor tended to Michael. The baby's fever still burned, but the medicine would need time to work. Eleanor bathed his small face with cool water, singing softly as his eyelids grew heavy. Only when he fell into fitful sleep did she allow herself to eat a few spoonfuls of soup, the rich flavor almost overwhelming, after weeks of near starvation. When Maria returned to check on them, Eleanor reluctantly prepared to leave her children. "I won't be long," she promised, kissing each of them. To Nathan, she added in a whisper, "Lock the door behind me." The boy nodded, his eyes serious beyond his years. Downstairs, she found Blackwood in what appeared to be a study. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, interrupted only by the stone fireplace and large windows that would offer views of the mountains in daylight. Now they reflected only darkness and the occasional flash of snow caught in the lamplight. Blackwood stood with his back to her, examining something on his desk. Without turning, he said, "Your son's condition is serious." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, remaining near the door. "But children are resilient. With proper care, he should recover." "And you can provide that care?" "I have experience with respiratory infections, if that's what you're asking." Blackwood turned, then studying her with those penetrating gray eyes. "It is partly." He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Please sit." Eleanor hesitated before complying. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight dusting of silver at his temples. He was handsome in a severe way, she realized, not with the easy charm some men cultivated, but with a kind of weathered strength that had endured storms, both literal and figurative. "I knew your husband," Blackwood said abruptly. The statement caught her off guard. "Daniel worked for you." "Not directly. He did some repair work on the fences a couple of summers ago." Blackwood's expression remained neutral. "He also came to me with proposals for improving safety in the mines." Eleanor's breath caught. Daniel had spoken of his ideas: often better support structures, improved ventilation systems, more frequent inspections. He had been passionate about protecting his fellow miners. "You rejected them," she said, the pieces falling into place. Blackwood didn't flinch from the accusation in her tone. "I did. The changes would have been expensive, and at the time I judged the existing precautions adequate." The honesty was unexpected and brutal. This man had denied the very improvements that might have saved Daniel's life, and now he was acknowledging it to his widow's face. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Because I believe in truth, Mrs. Foster, even uncomfortable truth." Blackwood's gaze never wavered. "A month after I dismissed your husband's proposals, the Northwest Tunnel collapsed. 7 men died, including Daniel. 3 others were seriously injured." Eleanor knew the toll all too well. She had spent Daniel's final days nursing him as his broken body failed, watching helplessly as the man she loved slipped away despite her medical knowledge. "If I had implemented even half of what he suggested, those men might be alive today." Blackwood's voice remained level, but something in his eyes had changed a shadow of what might have been regret. "I cannot change the past, but I can offer shelter to his family now." The revelation should have filled Eleanor with rage. She should have lashed out at this man whose negligence had cost her husband's life. Instead, she felt a strange, hollow calm. The truth, however painful, was preferable to platitudes or evasion. "Is that why you helped us, guilt?" she asked. "Partly," he admitted, "but also because no child should suffer for the mistakes of others, especially not in my territory." His territory. The phrasing was telling. This was a man accustomed to control, to responsibility over all he surveyed. Eleanor wondered if his help came with invisible strings, expectations she couldn't yet see. "What do you want from us, Mr. Blackwood?" Something like surprise flickered across his face. "Want," she clarified, "in exchange for your hospitality. I won't accept charity, but I'm willing to work. I can cook, clean, mend." "Mrs. Foster," he interrupted, "I'm not offering you employment. I'm offering sanctuary until spring, when the weather improves and you can make proper arrangements for your family." "Why, you've made it clear you barely knew my husband." Blackwood was silent for a moment, as though considering how much to reveal. "I've seen what winter does to those without shelter in this territory. I won't have that on my conscience as well." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion from upstairs interrupted them. The sound of a child's panicked voice calling for help. She was on her feet instantly, Blackwood close behind as they raced up the stairs. Nathan met them in the hallway, his face pale with fear. "It's Michael. He's not breathing right." Eleanor rushed into the bedroom to find her youngest son caught in the grip of a severe coughing fit, his tiny chest heaving as he struggled for air. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge that sent terror shooting through her. Moving on instinct and training, she lifted him from the cradle. "He needs steam," she said sharply. "Hot water as much as possible." Blackwood didn't hesitate. "Maria," he called, his voice carrying through the house. When the housekeeper appeared, he issued rapid instructions in Spanish that sent her hurrying away. Eleanor focused entirely on Michael, positioning him to ease his breathing, murmuring encouragement as she monitored his pulse. Sophie cowered in the corner, wide-eyed and frightened, while Nathan hovered anxiously nearby. "What can I do?" Blackwood asked, his deep voice cutting through her concentration. "I need my bundle," Eleanor said, nodding toward their few possessions. "The small leather pouch inside." Nathan retrieved it quickly. Eleanor's fingers found the small packet of herbs her grandmother had taught her to use for chest ailments, a mixture of mullein cherry bark and other plants not commonly used in Western medicine. She hesitated only briefly before opening it. These remedies were part of her Cherokee heritage, something she had been cautious about revealing in town. But her son's life mattered more than any concern about how Blackwood might judge her methods. Maria returned with a steaming kettle and basin. Blackwood took them from her, setting them near the bed as Eleanor directed. The room quickly filled with warm, moist air. Working swiftly, Eleanor mixed a small amount of herbal remedy with honey from the medical kit, then carefully helped Michael swallow it. His small body continued to struggle, each breath a battle. "There's a technique," she said, positioning her hands on Michael's back. "It helps clear the lungs." To her surprise, Blackwood moved closer. "Show me." Eleanor demonstrated the gentle percussion movements her grandmother had taught her, techniques she had later seen validated in medical texts. Blackwood watched intently, then replicated the motions on the other side of Michael's small back with unexpected precision. "You've done this before," she observed, not taking her eyes off her son. "Field medicine," he replied simply. "During the war." They worked in silence after that, the only sounds Michael's labored breathing and the soft murmurs of encouragement Eleanor offered. Gradually, painfully, the child's breathing eased. The blue tinge receded from his lips, and his desperate gasps transformed into the congested but steady breathing of a sick child rather than a dying one. Only when Michael finally fell into an exhausted sleep did Eleanor allow herself to acknowledge the trembling in her own limbs, the fear that had nearly overwhelmed her. "He'll need to be monitored through the night," Blackwood said, his voice low. "The crisis could return." Eleanor nodded, smoothing Michael's damp hair from his forehead. "I'll stay with him." "As will I," Blackwood stated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for the master of Silver Creek Ranch to sit vigil with a sick child he barely knew. "That's not necessary," Eleanor began. "I have medical training," he cut in. "Not extensive, but enough to recognize trouble if it returns. We'll take shifts." The revelation surprised her. "You were a doctor?" "Briefly before the war." Something in his tone discouraged further questions. "You should rest first. Your other children need you as well." Eleanor glanced at Nathan and Sophie, who had huddled together on the smaller bed, watching the proceedings with frightened eyes. They did need reassurance, especially after the terror of the past hour. "2 hours," she conceded. "Then I'll take over." Blackwood nodded and moved to the chair near the cradle. He sat with the straight-back posture of a military man, his gaze fixed on Michael's sleeping form with an intensity that might have been unnerving under different circumstances. Eleanor gathered Nathan and Sophie close, murmuring comfort and promises that their brother would be fine. Sophie fell asleep almost immediately, the day's events having drained her small reserves of energy. Nathan fought longer, determined to stay awake and vigilant, but eventually succumbed as well. Only then did Eleanor allow herself a moment of weakness. Silent tears slid down her cheeks. Tears of relief that Michael still breathed, tears of gratitude for the unexpected help, tears of grief for Daniel, whose absence felt especially acute in this moment of crisis. Across the room, Blackwood watched without comment, his expression inscrutable in the dim light. There was no pity in his gaze, for which Eleanor was grateful, just quiet acknowledgement of her strength and her pain. Outside, the storm raged against the window's snow and wind battering the glass like spirits seeking entry. But inside the blue room of Silver Creek Ranch, an unexpected truce had formed between two wounded souls, one grieving a husband, the other haunted by choices that could never be unmade. Dawn broke cold and clear, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the night. Eleanor woke with a jolt, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day rushed back the desperate situation behind the blacksmith's shop, Blackwood's unexpected offer, Michael's medical crisis. She turned quickly toward the cradle, fear clutching at her heart, but the sight that greeted her was not what she expected. Wyatt Blackwood stood by the window, Michael cradled securely in his arms. The first rays of sunlight illuminated them both, the large weathered man and the tiny child who rested peacefully against his chest. Blackwood was speaking quietly, his deep voice a gentle rumble as he pointed out something in the distance. The mountains look different after a storm, he was saying, cleaner somehow, as if the snow washes away all the rough edges. It was such an unexpectedly poetic observation from a man reputed to be cold and taciturn that Eleanor remained still unwilling to break the moment. Michael seemed content in Blackwood's arms, his breathing still congested, but significantly improved from the crisis of the night before. As if sensing her gaze, Blackwood turned. There was no embarrassment in his expression at being caught in this gentle interaction, only a quiet acknowledgement. His fever broke around 3. The herbal remedy was effective. Eleanor rose carefully, trying not to disturb Nathan and Sophie, who still slept soundly. She crossed to where Blackwood stood and reached for Michael. The child came to her willingly, but without the desperate clinging of illness. "Thank you," she said, meaning it for far more than just the night's vigil. Blackwood nodded once. "Maria will bring breakfast soon. We should discuss arrangements for your stay." Just like that, the brief moment of connection was gone, replaced by the practical concerns of their unusual situation. Yet something had shifted, a small but significant change in how they regarded each other. "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor began, needing to establish clarity. "I meant what I said last night. I won't accept charity. If we're to stay until spring, I insist on contributing to the household." He studied her for a moment, those gray eyes missing nothing, not the proud tilt of her chin, nor the determination in her stance, despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "Very well," he said finally. "Maria can use permanent assistance with the household duties. The winter months are difficult, and she isn't as young as she once was, though she'd never admit it." His lips quirked slightly, the closest thing to a smile Eleanor had seen from him. "And the children, Nathan is old enough to help Samuel Porter, my ranch manager, with some of the lighter chores if he wishes. The girl—" He paused, seeming to realize he didn't know Sophie's name. "Sophie," Eleanor replied. "She's 5. Sophie can continue her education. There are plenty of books in the library." The generosity of the offer was unexpected, not just shelter and food, but consideration for her children's development as well. "Why are you doing this?" she asked directly. "The truth, Mr. Blackwood, not just about Daniel or the winter." Blackwood was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the snow-covered landscape beyond the window. "This house was built for a family," he said finally. "It's been too quiet since Elizabeth died." The admission seemed to cost him something. Eleanor understood instinctively that Wyatt Blackwood was not a man who easily revealed vulnerability, who spoke of his losses or his loneliness. Before she could respond, a knock at the door preceded Maria's entrance with a breakfast tray. The housekeeper's expression had softened somewhat since the previous evening, especially when she saw Michael alert and improved in Eleanor's arms. "The medicine worked," she observed. "Your grandmother's recipe." Eleanor tensed slightly, wondering how Maria knew about her Cherokee heritage. The older woman must have sensed her concern. "My mother used similar remedies," Maria explained with a small smile. "Not Cherokee, but Yaqui. The wisdom of our grandmothers crosses many borders." This unexpected connection eased some of Eleanor's apprehension. If Maria and Blackwood accepted her heritage without judgment, perhaps Silver Creek Ranch could indeed be a safe haven until spring. Breakfast was simple but nourishing: fresh bread, eggs, and porridge sweetened with honey. Nathan and Sophie woke to the smell of food, their initial wariness quickly overcome by hunger. Michael even managed a few spoonfuls of porridge, a promising sign of recovery. After they had eaten, Blackwood excused himself to attend to ranch business, leaving the Foster family to settle into their temporary quarters. Maria helped Eleanor find clean clothes for the children from a trunk of items that had apparently belonged to the household staff's families over the years. "Senor Blackwood keeps everything," Maria explained as she pulled out a small shirt that would fit Nathan perfectly. "He believes in being prepared for when something might be needed again." Eleanor was struck by the practicality of this, so at odds with the wasteful habits she had observed among other wealthy individuals. It spoke of a man who understood the value of resources, who perhaps had not always enjoyed the security he now possessed. As the morning progressed, Eleanor explored the immediate surroundings with her children. The main house was larger than it had appeared from outside. 2 stories with numerous bedrooms upstairs, formal dining and sitting rooms downstairs, along with Blackwood's study, a large kitchen, and most impressively, a library that made Sophie gasp with delight. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, with comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace and a large desk positioned to catch the natural light from tall windows. It was clearly a room designed for both work and pleasure, a sanctuary of knowledge. "Can I really read any of these?" Sophie asked, her small fingers already reaching toward a volume with a colorful spine. "If Mr. Blackwood said so, then yes," Eleanor replied, though she made a mental note to check which books might be appropriate for a 5-year-old's curious mind. Nathan showed less enthusiasm for the library than his sister. His attention was drawn outdoors where men moved about the ranch performing various tasks despite the heavy snow. Eleanor could see the longing in his eyes, the desire to be part of that world of men, to prove his usefulness in ways that mattered to an 8-year-old boy who had been trying to be the man of the family for too long. "Perhaps Mr. Porter could show you around this afternoon," she suggested, "after you've rested." Nathan looked ready to protest the need for rest, but a stern glance from his mother silenced him. He was still a child despite the responsibilities he had shouldered, and the past days had taxed his strength as surely as they had Sophie's and Michael's. Around midday, Maria found Eleanor in the blue room where she was changing the linens while Michael napped in the cradle. "Senor Blackwood asked me to show you something," the housekeeper said, "if the little one is sleeping soundly." Curious Eleanor checked Michael once more, then followed Maria down the hallway to a door she hadn't noticed during their earlier exploration. Maria unlocked it with a key from the ring at her waist, then stepped back to allow Eleanor entry. The room beyond was clearly a woman's domain. Delicate curtains framed the windows. A dressing table held silver-backed brushes and crystal bottles. A portrait hung above the fireplace, a beautiful young woman with dark hair and kind eyes that seemed to follow Eleanor as she moved hesitantly into the space. "Mrs. Elizabeth's room," Maria explained softly. "Senor Blackwood has kept it just as it was." Eleanor felt like an intruder in this preserved memorial to Wyatt's wife. "Why show me this?" Maria moved to a large wardrobe and opened it, revealing dresses in various styles and colors. "Winter is long and you have only what you carried. The Senora was taller than you, but I can alter what's needed." The offer stunned Eleanor. These weren't just any clothes, but the personal belongings of Blackwood's beloved wife. That he would offer them to a near stranger spoke of either exceptional generosity or a desire to finally move forward from his grief. "I couldn't possibly," she started. "Senor Blackwood," Maria interrupted gently, "said there is no sense in good fabric going to waste when it could be useful." She ran a hand over a deep blue dress. The Senora would have approved. She was practical that way. Eleanor looked again at the portrait, studying Elizabeth Blackwood's face more closely. There was kindness there, yes, but also strength. The same quiet determination she had glimpsed in Wyatt during Michael's medical crisis. She was a healer too. Maria continued, following Eleanor's gaze to the portrait. "Not a doctor, but she knew plants' remedies. The Senora's garden still grows behind the kitchen, or it will again come spring." This new information shifted Eleanor's understanding of why Blackwood might have recognized and respected her own healing knowledge. Perhaps he had seen similar skills in his wife. "Tell me about her," Eleanor requested, curious about the woman whose presence still filled this room 3 years after her death. Maria's expression softened with memory. "She came from Boston, very educated but not proud. Learned Spanish to speak with me and the other workers. Loved books and music and growing things." She paused, her eyes distant. "The Senor was different when she was alive," he smiled then. The wistfulness in Maria's voice spoke volumes about the household's loss, not just Blackwood's grief, but a collective mourning for the light that had gone out of Silver Creek Ranch. "And the baby?" Eleanor asked gently. "A boy. They would have named him Michael after the Senor's brother who died in the war." Maria crossed herself. "The Senora had difficulty carrying children. Lost 2 before this one came so far. The doctor warned them, but—" She shook her head. "Some things are God's will, even when we don't understand." Eleanor wasn't sure she agreed with that sentiment. Her medical training and personal experience had taught her that too many tragedies attributed to God's will were actually the result of human error or inadequate care. But she understood the comfort such beliefs provided. "Thank you for showing me," she said, turning to leave the preserved shrine to a woman she would never meet. Please tell Mr. Blackwood I appreciate the offer of clothing, but I would need to consider it. Maria nodded, respecting Eleanor's hesitation. As they left the room, the housekeeper locked the door carefully behind them, returning the key to its place among many others on her ring. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small domestic activities. Michael continued to improve, though Eleanor maintained a careful watch for any return of his respiratory distress. Sophie discovered a box of colored pencils in the library and spent hours drawing elaborate pictures of the ranch as she imagined it in spring. Nathan, after a reluctant nap, was introduced to Samuel Porter, who gruffly but kindly showed him around the barn and allowed him to help feed the horses. By evening, an uneasy truce had settled over the unusual household. The Fosters were no longer immediate strangers, but not yet integrated into the daily life of Silver Creek Ranch. They existed in a liminal space between guest and resident, their future beyond the winter months, an unspoken question mark hanging in the air. Dinner was served in the formal dining room with Blackwood at the head of the table and the Fosters arranged along one side. The massive oak table, designed to seat at least 16, made their small group seem even more isolated in the large room. Maria had prepared a hearty stew with fresh bread, simple fare but more substantial than anything the Fosters had eaten in weeks. The meal began in awkward silence. Nathan ate with the focused intensity of a child who remembered hunger too well, while Sophie stared wide-eyed at the silver candlesticks and fine china. Michael settled on Eleanor's lap, seemed content to gum a piece of soft bread, his appetite returning as his fever receded. "Your son seems much improved," Blackwood observed, breaking the silence. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "The treatment was effective. Thank you again for your help." Blackwood acknowledged her gratitude with a slight nod. "You have knowledge beyond standard nursing training. It's uncommon to have such extensive training, especially in both Western and traditional methods." Eleanor watched carefully for his reaction. "My grandmother was Cherokee. She taught me about plants and healing methods passed down through generations. I later found many of her treatments validated by medical texts, though doctors rarely acknowledge such sources. Intelligence often wears different clothing across cultures," Blackwood replied, surprising her with the insight. "During the war, I saw men survive because of treatments the Army surgeons dismissed as primitive." The reference to his military service offered an opening. "You were a field officer." A shadow crossed his face. "Yes, Union cavalry. We can leave the details for another time." His tone made it clear the subject was closed for now. The conversation might have lapsed back into uncomfortable silence, if not for Sophie, who had been studying Blackwood with the unabashed curiosity of childhood. "Do you have any children, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, seemingly unaware of the painful territory she was entering. "Sophie," Eleanor began, but Blackwood held up a hand. "It's a fair question," he said. To Sophie, he answered simply, "No, I don't. My wife and son died 3 years ago." Sophie's face fell. "I'm sorry, it's very sad when people die." Yes, it is." Blackwood's response was gentle despite the brevity. "Our papa died too," Sophie continued. "He was trapped in the dark, and Mama couldn't fix him, even though she tried really hard." The innocent recounting of Daniel's final days sent a stab of pain through Eleanor's heart. She had done everything possible with her limited resources, sitting vigil by his bedside for days, as his broken body failed and infection set in. The memory of her helplessness still haunted her. Blackwood's gaze met hers across the table, something like understanding passing between them. Not pity, which she would have resented, but recognition of a shared experience. The particular agony of watching someone you love slip away, despite your desperate efforts to save them. "Your mother is very skilled," Blackwood told Sophie seriously. "If she couldn't save him, no one could have." The simple statement, delivered with absolute conviction, eased a burden Eleanor hadn't realized she was still carrying. The possibility that she had missed something, that some other treatment might have saved Daniel, had lingered in her subconscious for months. "That's what I told her," Nathan spoke up unexpectedly. "But she still cries sometimes when she thinks we're sleeping." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at this exposure of her private grief. "Nathan, grief isn't something to hide," Blackwood interrupted, his voice low but firm. "It's the price we pay for having loved deeply." The wisdom in his words silenced any rebuke Eleanor might have offered. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the truth he had spoken. The remainder of the meal passed more comfortably, with occasional questions from the children about the ranch and cautious responses from Blackwood. He was not a naturally talkative man, Eleanor observed, but he made an effort to engage with Sophie's curiosity and Nathan's more practical questions about the horses and cattle. After dinner, Blackwood excused himself to his study while Eleanor supervised the children's preparation for bed. The blue room had been arranged to accommodate all four Fosters, the large bed for Eleanor and Michael, the smaller one for Nathan and Sophie. The arrangement was far more comfortable than anything they had experienced since losing their home, and yet Eleanor couldn't help feeling the precariousness of their situation. Once the children were settled, she found herself restless. Michael was sleeping peacefully, his breathing much improved, and the older children had succumbed quickly to exhaustion. But Eleanor's mind was too active for sleep, filled with questions about their mysterious host and uncertainty about the future. The house was quiet as she made her way downstairs, drawn to the library she had glimpsed earlier. Perhaps reading would settle her thoughts enough for sleep. She was surprised to find the library already occupied. Blackwood sat in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, a book open in his hands, though his gaze was fixed on the flames rather than the pages. A glass of amber liquid rested on the small table beside him. "I apologize for disturbing you," Eleanor said, preparing to retreat. Blackwood looked up, seeming unsurprised by her presence. "No disturbance. The library is available to everyone in the house." He gestured to the chair opposite his, an invitation Eleanor hesitated to accept. Being alone with Blackwood in the intimate setting of the firelit library felt different from their previous interactions, more personal, less defined by circumstance. Yet something compelled her to stay. Perhaps curiosity about this complex man who had offered shelter to her family. Perhaps simply the human need for adult conversation after months of speaking primarily to her children. She took the offered seat, arranging Maria's hastily adjusted skirt around her legs. The fire's warmth was welcome after the chill of the upstairs hallway. "Your son," Blackwood said after a moment of silence. "He carries a heavy burden for one so young." Eleanor sighed, knowing he meant Nathan. "He's been trying to be the man of the family since Daniel died. I've told him he's just a boy, that he doesn't need to take on such responsibility. But he feels it nonetheless," Blackwood finished. There was something in his tone of personal understanding that went beyond observation. Eleanor studied him more carefully, noting the fine lines around his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw, even in repose. "You speak from experience." Blackwood took a sip of his drink before answering. "My father died when I was 12. Mother followed 2 years later. I had 3 younger brothers to raise." The revelation explained much about the man before her. His self-containment, his comfort with responsibility, his willingness to take charge of situations others might avoid. "That must have been difficult," Eleanor said, genuine sympathy in her voice. "It was what needed to be done." Blackwood's matter-of-fact tone suggested he had never considered any other option. Robert was 10, Jonathan 8, and Michael only 6. There was no other family to take them. "What happened to them, your brothers?" "Robert runs the family shipping business in Boston. Very successful, very proper." There was a hint of something like affectionate criticism in his voice. "Jonathan became a minister in Chicago." "And Michael," she prompted when he paused. "Michael died in the war, under my command." The weight of those final words hung in the air between them. Eleanor understood immediately the particular guilt Blackwood carried, not just for failing to protect a soldier, but for losing a brother he had raised as a son. "I'm sorry," she said, simply knowing no other words could address such a loss. Blackwood nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without inviting further discussion. He changed the subject with deliberate care. "Your medical knowledge, it's uncommon for a field nurse to have such extensive training, especially in both Western and traditional methods." Eleanor recognized the deflection, but allowed it. Some wounds were too deep to probe, especially with a near stranger. "I was fortunate. My grandmother taught me from childhood, and during the war I assisted a doctor who was more open-minded than most. He allowed me to study his medical texts and learn procedures when others would have limited me to changing bandages and writing letters home." "Dr. Elliot Hayes?" Blackwood asked, surprising her. "Yes." "How did you know?" A slight softening around Blackwood's eyes might have been the ghost of a smile. Hayes was known for his unorthodox approaches both to medicine and to who could practice it. "He treated men in my regiment after Antietam. Brilliant surgeon, terrible poker player." The unexpected connection brought a genuine smile to Eleanor's face. He mentioned his gambling losses often, said they taught him more about human nature than medical school ever did. For a brief moment, they shared the camaraderie of having known the same remarkable individual, a bridge across their very different experiences of the war. He would be pleased to see how you have applied his teachings, Blackwood observed. I haven't, not really, Eleanor admitted, the smile fading from her face. Not since Daniel. In town, people were suspicious of my methods, called them folk remedies at best, witch doctoring at worst. I kept my knowledge to myself except when the children were ill. A waste of valuable skills. Blackwood said, his tone suggesting he found the townspeople's attitudes foolish rather than Eleanor's continued practice questionable. Perhaps Eleanor stared into the fire memories of her husband's final days washing over her. It didn't save Daniel. Tell me what happened, Blackwood requested quietly. If you're willing. Eleanor hesitated. She had never spoken in detail about Daniel's death to anyone. The town had its version, a tragic mining accident, a widow's brave but futile nursing, but no one had asked for her experience, her perspective. The support beam that fell caught him across the chest and legs. She began, her voice steadier than she expected. He was buried for almost 2 hours before they got him out. By then, internal bleeding had already started, and his lungs were damaged from the dust and lack of air. Blackwood listened without interruption, his attention complete and focused. I tried everything, poultices for the bruising, tinctures for the pain, steam for his breathing. Dr. Patterson came once, said there was nothing to be done except make him comfortable. The bitterness in her voice was impossible to disguise. Daniel lasted 8 days conscious until the 6th, though the pain was... She swallowed hard. The pain was terrible. You eased his suffering, Blackwood said with certainty. That's no small thing. Is it enough? The question escaped before she could stop it, the doubt that had plagued her for months finally given voice. Blackwood considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I've seen men die quickly, and men die slowly in battle and in field hospitals. Those who had someone to ease their way, to bear witness to their pain and their courage, they died differently, more at peace. He met her gaze directly. You gave Daniel that gift. Never doubt its value. The simple validation delivered without sentiment or pity released something tight and painful in Eleanor's chest. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away or attempt to hide them. Thank you, she whispered. Blackwood nodded once and set aside his empty glass. It's late. The children will wake early. The gentle reminder of practical matters helped Eleanor regain her composure. She rose from the chair, smoothing her borrowed skirt. Yes, of course. Good night, Mr. Blackwood. Wyatt, he said unexpectedly, if we're to share a household until spring, Mr. Blackwood seems unnecessarily formal. The offer of his given name represented a small but significant shift in their relationship from reluctant benefactor and recipient to something approaching equals. Wyatt, she acknowledged with a slight nod. Then you must call me Eleanor. Eleanor, he repeated, as if testing how the name felt. Good night. As she climbed the stairs to the blue room where her children slept, Eleanor reflected on the strange turns life could take. Yesterday, they had been huddled behind a blacksmith shop, facing the very real possibility that Michael might not survive the winter. Tonight, they were ensconced in the finest house in the territory, under the protection of a man who carried his own complicated griefs and responsibilities. She had no illusions about their situation. Spring would come eventually, and with it, decisions about their future. But for now, for this night, at least they were safe. It was more than she had dared hope for in the darkest moments of the past months. Outside, the moon rose over the snow-covered mountains, casting Silver Creek Ranch in silver light. Inside, 2 wounded souls had taken the first cautious steps towards something that might in time resemble healing. The days at Silver Creek Ranch settled into an unexpected rhythm. Eleanor found her place in the household with surprising ease, working alongside Maria in the kitchen and helping with the endless tasks that kept the large house functioning during the harsh Montana winter. The children adapted even more quickly. Sophie spent hours in the library devouring picture books and learning to write her letters more precisely. Michael grew stronger daily, his baby laughter once again filling the air. And Nathan, initially the most resistant, found purpose in the daily routines of ranch life. 2 weeks after their arrival, a heavy snowfall blanketed the property, transforming the landscape into an unbroken sea of white. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window watching as Nathan helped Samuel Porter clear a path to the barn. The boy's small figure was dwarfed by the snow shovel, but he worked with determined energy. "He's a good worker, that one," Maria observed, kneading bread dough with practiced hands. "Reminds me of my Miguel always wanting to prove himself." Eleanor had learned bits and pieces about Maria's son over the past weeks. How he had joined the Union Army despite his mother's fears, how he had served under Wyatt's command and never returned. The shared loss had created an unspoken bond between the two women, bridging differences in age, background, and position. "Nathan's always been responsible," Eleanor said, pride warming her voice, "even before Daniel died. But lately I worry he's forgotten how to be a child." Maria shaped the dough into loaves with deft movements. "Children are stronger than we think. They bend, but don't break easily." She slid the bread into the oven, then turned to Eleanor with unexpected directness. "The Senor watches him. Did you notice especially when the bush works with the horses?" Eleanor had noticed. Wyatt's attention to her children went beyond ordinary courtesy or obligation. He answered Sophie's endless questions with patient detail. He held Michael with a gentle confidence that belied his stern reputation, and he observed Nathan with a particular intensity, not critical but watchful, as if searching for something in the boy's determined efforts. "Wyatt mentioned he raised his brothers after their parents died," Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. "Perhaps he sees something of himself in Nathan." Maria made a small sound of agreement. "Family is important to the Senor, though he rarely speaks of it. The Senora's death changed him, made him," she searched for the right word, "solitary like a wolf who has lost his pack." The poetic description seemed fitting for Wyatt Blackwood. In the 2 weeks they had been at Silver Creek, Eleanor had observed his self-contained nature, his habit of watching rather than participating, his careful maintenance of invisible boundaries. Yet she had also glimpsed moments of unexpected warmth, his patience with Sophie's curiosity, his gentle handling of Michael, his quiet respect for Eleanor's medical knowledge. The back door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and the sound of men's voices. Samuel Porter entered, first stamping snow from his boots, followed by Nathan, whose cheeks were red with cold, but whose eyes shone with the satisfaction of work well done. "Paths clear to the barn and corrals," Porter reported. "Young Nathan here's got a strong back for a city boy." Nathan straightened at the compliment, though Eleanor noted the slight frown at being called a city boy. Before he could correct the ranch manager, Wyatt appeared in the doorway behind them, his tall frame filling the space. "Good work," he said simply, but his gaze lingered on Nathan with approval that made the boy stand even taller. Maria immediately moved to pour coffee for the men and hot chocolate for Nathan. The hospitality so automatic it seemed an extension of her breathing. "Sit warm yourselves," she instructed. "Bread will be ready soon." Wyatt removed his heavy coat, revealing a flannel shirt that had seen better days, a working man's garment rather than a wealthy rancher's. The contradiction between his evident wealth and his practical habits continued to intrigue Eleanor. Most prosperous men she had encountered took pains to display their status in their clothing, their speech, their every gesture. Wyatt seemed almost deliberately to minimize his. "The north pasture fence needs checking," he said to Porter as they settled at the kitchen table. "With this much snow, we could lose sections if it gives way." Porter nodded. "I'll take Williams and Tucker tomorrow if the weather holds." "I'll come too," Nathan interjected eagerly. The men exchanged a glance over the boy's head. Porter questioning Wyatt, considering. It was Wyatt who answered. "The north pasture is 3 miles out, Nathan. Difficult terrain, especially in snow this deep." "I can ride," Nathan insisted. "Papa taught me before." He stopped, a shadow crossing his face at the mention of Daniel. Eleanor watched the interaction with mixed feelings. Part of her wanted to protect Nathan from disappointment and from physical hardship from the constant reminders of his father's absence. Another part recognized his need to test himself to find his place in this new environment. Wyatt seemed to understand the complexity of the moment. "The distance is the concern, not your riding ability," he said carefully. "But there's work closer to home that requires skill with horses. The yearlings need exercise despite the snow. Samuel can show you how to lead them safely around the paddock." It was a thoughtful compromise, acknowledging Nathan's abilities while respecting his age and experience. The boy considered this, then nodded, accepting the alternative with more grace than the yeoner had expected. "If you're to work with the yearlings, you'll need proper gloves." Wyatt continued, rising from the table. Wait here. He disappeared into the main house, returning minutes later with a pair of leather work gloves. They were well made, but clearly used broken in by years of ranch work. These were Michael's when he was about your age, Wyatt said, handing them to Nathan. He had smaller hands than Robert or Jonathan. The gift carried weight beyond its practical value. Eleanor understood immediately that these weren't just any gloves, but a personal connection to Wyatt's youngest brother, the one who had died in the war, the one whose loss still shadowed him. Nathan seemed to sense the significance as well. He accepted the gloves with unusual solemnity, turning them over in his hands before carefully trying them on. They were still slightly large but serviceable. Thank you, sir, he said with uncharacteristic formality. I'll take good care of them. Wyatt nodded once, his expression giving away little, but Eleanor caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Memory, perhaps, or the particular pain of seeing a treasured object put to use after long storage. The moment was interrupted by Sophie's arrival, her arms filled with books she could barely carry. Mama, Mr. Blackwood's library has stories about horses and mountains, and she stopped, noticing the gathering in the kitchen. Oh, are we having a party? Her innocent question broke the solemn mood. Maria chuckled, taking the stack of books before they could topple. No party, Chiquita, just warming up after snow work, but we will have fresh bread soon. With honey, Sophie asked hopefully. With honey, Maria confirmed, smiling at the child's simple delight. As the kitchen filled with the aroma of baking bread and the comfortable sounds of conversation, Eleanor caught Wyatt watching her. His gaze was thoughtful, assessing in a way that might have made her uncomfortable from another man, but from him felt more like genuine interest than judgment. She raised an eyebrow in silent question. You have remarkable children, he said quietly, moving to stand beside her at the window. They've adapted well to difficult circumstances. They take after their father, Inanna replied. Daniel was nothing if not adaptable. Wyatt considered this. And their mother, he added. Resilience isn't inherited only through fathers. The simple acknowledgement of her contribution to her children's character touched Eleanor unexpectedly. So much of her identity had been subsumed in grief and survival these past months that she had almost forgotten the woman she had been before, capable, educated, confident in her abilities. Thank you, she said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the front of the house, the sound of horses approaching, then a door opening and voices calling out. Wyatt straightened, immediately alert. We're not expecting visitors, he said, moving toward the main house with long strides. Eleanor followed, curious and slightly concerned. Visitors were rare in winter, especially after a heavy snowfall made the roads nearly impassable. In the main hall, they found Dr. Thomas Patterson removing his snow-covered coat, his normally ruddy face pale with cold. The doctor's appearance was a surprise in itself. He rarely left town during winter, unless for serious emergencies. But even more surprising was his obvious sobriety. In the months since Daniel's death, Eleanor had never seen Patterson without the telltale flush and slightly unfocused gaze of a man who relied on whiskey to get through his days. Blackwood, Patterson greeted, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. Apologies for arriving unannounced, but there's illness in town. 3 cases already, all with the same symptoms. Wyatt gestured toward the study where a fire burned steadily. Come warm yourself and tell me what's happening. Patterson nodded, then noticed Eleanor. His expression shifted to one of awkward recognition. Mrs. Foster, I heard you and the children had found shelter here. He cleared his throat. How is the little one, the baby? Michael is recovering well, thank you, Eleanor replied, keeping her tone neutral, despite the memory of Patterson's single cursory visit during Daniel's final days. The doctor had the grace to look uncomfortable. Glad to hear it. Children's ailments can turn quickly in winter. He followed Wyatt into the study, leaving Eleanor to wonder what illness could be severe enough to bring Patterson all the way to Silver Creek in such weather. Her curiosity overcame her reluctance to engage with the doctor. She followed them into the study where Patterson was already seated near the fire, a glass of Wyatt's whiskey in his hand, though she noted he had not yet drunk from it. What are the symptoms? Wyatt was asking, his tone businesslike. High fever, difficulty, breathing, confusion, Patterson replied. The Turner boy was first 3 days ago, then Mrs. Clancy yesterday morning, and now Reverend Brooks as of this morning. He shook his head. Similar to influenza, but progressing more rapidly. I've tried the usual treatments, quinine, mustard plasters, steam inhalation with limited effect. Eleanor's medical training immediately engaged. Age of the patients. Any common factors besides location? Patterson looked startled by her intervention but answered readily enough. Boy is 7, Mrs. Clancy 43, Reverend 61. No obvious connection except they all attended the church social last week. Incubation period would be right. Any respiratory symptoms before the fever? Eleanor mused. The boy had a slight cough, according to his mother. Nothing unusual for winter, Patterson had responded. Mrs. Clancy mentioned feeling unusually tired for several days prior. Wyatt observed their exchange with interest. You think it's contagious, then? Almost certainly, Patterson confirmed grimly, which is why I'm here. If it spreads throughout the town. He didn't need to finish the thought. In a small community like Hollow Trace, a highly contagious illness could be devastating, especially during winter, when people were confined indoors and medical supplies were limited. What do you need from us? Wyatt asked directly. Patterson set down his untouched whiskey. I've depleted my supplies of willow bark extract and several other essentials. I know you keep a well-stocked medical cabinet, Blackwood, better than most in the territory. Wyatt nodded. Of course, whatever you need. There's something else. Patterson continued, his gaze shifting to Eleanor. Mrs. Foster, I understand you have alternative remedies, treatments not found in standard medical texts. The request implicit in his statement surprised Eleanor. This was the same man who had dismissed her suggestions during Daniel's final days, who had called her grandmother's methods superstitious nonsense when she tried to explain the properties of certain herbs. I do, she acknowledged cautiously. The Cherokee have treatments for respiratory ailments that have proven effective. I've seen it myself, Patterson said, the admission clearly difficult for his professional pride, though I've been reluctant to incorporate such methods. Eleanor considered the request carefully. Her knowledge was a precious inheritance passed down through generations of women who had been dismissed, ridiculed, or worse for their healing practices. Yet it was also meant to ease suffering, to heal those in need regardless of their previous attitudes. I used a combination of mullein cherry bark and honey for Michael, she said finally, along with steam treatments and a particular massage technique for the chest and back. I can prepare some for your patients and show you the method. Relief crossed Patterson's face. Thank you. I wouldn't ask if you weren't desperate, Eleanor finished for him, unable to keep a hint of sharpness from her tone. Desperation often leads to wisdom, Dr. Patterson. Perhaps earlier openness might have saved others pain. The pointed reference to Daniel hung in the air between them. Patterson had the grace to look ashamed. You're right, of course. I've been set my ways to my patient's detriment. Wyatt, who had been observing this exchange with quiet attention, stepped in before Eleanor could respond. Maria can help gather whatever supplies you need, Mrs. Foster. My study has writing materials if you wish to document the treatments for Dr. Patterson. The practical suggestion diffused the tension. Eleanor nodded, recognizing that this was not the time for old grievances, however justified. I'll need an hour or so to prepare everything properly. Patterson rose, setting aside his still untouched whiskey. I should return to town as soon as possible. The Reverend's condition was particularly concerning. You'll stay for a meal first, Wyatt said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. It's a long ride back in this weather, and you'll do your patients no good if you collapse from exhaustion halfway there. The doctor looked ready to argue, but seemed to think better of it. Perhaps a brief rest would be wise. As they moved to the kitchen where Maria was setting out the freshly baked bread, Eleanor found herself walking beside Wyatt. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For not questioning my knowledge, for treating it as valid as Patterson's medical training. Wyatt's expression remained neutral, but his response revealed more than his face. I judge methods by their effectiveness, not their origin. Your son's recovery speaks for itself. It was a simple statement, but represented a perspective Eleanor had rarely encountered outside her grandmother's teachings. Most men of education and position, especially those with military backgrounds like Wyatt, held firmly to conventional Western medicine and dismissed traditional practices as primitive or superstitious. The next hour passed in focused activity. Eleanor gathered the necessary herbs from her dwindling personal supply, prepared the remedies with Maria's help, and wrote detailed instructions for Patterson to follow. The doctor watched attentively as she demonstrated the chest percussion technique on a pillow, asking surprisingly thoughtful questions about timing and pressure. When everything was prepared and packaged for transport, Patterson approached Eleanor with an awkwardness that suggested he was unaccustomed to apologies. "Mrs. Foster," he began, clearing his throat, "I must acknowledge that I misjudged your methods previously and perhaps neglected your husband's care as a result." He met her gaze directly, the professional arrogance replaced by genuine regret. "It is a failure I have carried heavily." Eleanor had not expected this confession. For months, she had nursed resentment toward Patterson for his dismissive attitude during Daniel's final days, for the way he had pronounced her husband's condition hopeless after a single brief examination. To hear him admit his failure now stirred complicated emotions. "Daniel's injuries were severe," she said finally. "I don't know that any treatment would have saved him, but he deserved our best efforts all the same." Patterson nodded, accepting both the partial absolution and the implicit rebuke. "If these remedies prove effective for the current illness, perhaps we might collaborate in the future. Your knowledge combined with my training could benefit many in Hollow Trace." The offer represented a significant shift, not just in Patterson's attitude toward Eleanor personally, but in his willingness to integrate different healing traditions. It was more than she would have thought possible from the man she had known before. "I would consider that," she said carefully, "though my future plans remain uncertain." "Of course." Patterson glanced toward Wyatt, who was discussing the town's situation with Porter nearby. "Though I imagine Silver Creek could benefit from a skilled healer as well." Before Eleanor could respond to this unexpected suggestion, Wyatt approached to inform Patterson that his horse was ready. The doctor took his leave with renewed purpose, the package of remedies secured safely in his saddlebags, his demeanor more focused than Eleanor had seen since before Daniel's death. As they watched Patterson's figure diminish against the snow-covered landscape, Wyatt stood silently beside Eleanor on the porch, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "He's drinking less," Eleanor observed. "Yes," Wyatt agreed, "since just after Christmas, according to Porter. No one knows why." Eleanor considered this. Sometimes it takes a crisis to shake a man out of destructive patterns. Or perhaps he simply reached the point where the pain of continuing, as he was, exceeded the pain of change. Wyatt glanced at her, something like surprise in his expression. "That's insightful." "My grandmother was wise about more than just herbs," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "She understood people's hearts as well as their bodies." They stood in companionable silence for a moment longer, watching as the winter sun cast long shadows across the unmarked snow. The peaceful scene belied the potential crisis unfolding in town. Yet Eleanor found herself grateful for this temporary sanctuary, not just for her children, but for herself as well. That evening, after the children were asleep, Eleanor found herself unable to rest. The day's events had stirred memories of her nursing work during the war, of the desperate scramble to save lives with limited supplies and knowledge. She had been barely 20, then thrown into chaos that transformed her from a sheltered girl into a woman intimately acquainted with suffering and death. Restless, she made her way downstairs, drawn again to the library with its wealth of books and comforting smell of leather and paper. The house was quiet, most of its occupants having retired early after the physically demanding work of clearing snow. To her surprise, Wyatt was once again in the library, though this time he wasn't reading. He stood at the large desk near the window, examining what appeared to be maps spread across its surface. He looked up at her entrance, nodding in acknowledgement, but not seeming particularly startled by her presence. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked. "Too many thoughts," Eleanor admitted. The situation in town brought back memories. Wyatt studied her for a moment, then gestured to the maps. "Perhaps a distraction might help. I'm planning the spring cattle drive routes." Curious, Eleanor moved closer to examine the detailed maps of the territory. Wyatt had marked various trails in red ink with notations about water sources, terrain difficulties, and estimated travel times. "You take the cattle to market yourself?" she asked, somewhat surprised that a man of his wealth would undertake such a physically demanding task rather than delegating it entirely. "I lead the drive, yes. It's a significant portion of the ranch's income, and I prefer to oversee it personally." He traced one of the routes with his finger. "This northern path adds 3 days to the journey but avoids Blackfoot territory. The southern route is faster but requires negotiating passage rights." Eleanor studied the maps with genuine interest. Her life before coming to Montana had been primarily urban, first in Pennsylvania, where she was raised, then in the various towns where military hospitals had been established during the war. The vast open spaces of the territory with their complex web of natural features, property boundaries, and tribal lands represented a different kind of navigation than she had ever needed to master. "It's like planning a military campaign," she observed. Wyatt's eyebrow raised slightly. "An apt comparison. Logistics, terrain, assessment, contingency planning, the principles are similar, though the stakes less lethal. Unless you encounter bandits or hostile tribes," Eleanor pointed out. "True enough." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You have a strategic mind, Eleanor." The compliment delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence caught her off guard. Few men had ever acknowledged her intelligence so directly without qualification or condescension. Even Daniel, supportive as he had been of her nursing work, had sometimes gently steered her away from unfeminine interests in strategy or politics. "My father was a mathematics professor," she explained. "He believed girls should develop their minds as rigorously as boys, much to my mother's occasional dismay." "Your parents permitted your nursing work during the war?" Wyatt asked, his tone suggesting he found this unusual. "My father had died the year before, and my mother," Eleanor paused, considering how to explain her mother's complex reaction. "She objected initially on grounds of propriety, but her brother, my uncle, was a surgeon with the Union Army. When he requested my assistance specifically, she relented, though I think she always hoped I would return to a more conventional life afterward." "Which you did by marrying Daniel." "Yes and no." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "Daniel was a patient in my uncle's field hospital, minor. Wound, nothing serious. He respected my work, said he'd never met a woman who could discuss battlefield strategy and wound treatment with equal facility. When he proposed, he promised I could continue my education, perhaps even attend medical school after the war. But that didn't happen." Wyatt observed, his tone neutral rather than judgmental. "Life intervened." Eleanor agreed with a slight shrug. "Peace brought different priorities. Daniel's mining work took us west. Children came in medical schools." She sighed. "They remain reluctant to admit women regardless of experience or qualification." Wyatt considered this with a thoughtfulness that suggested he was truly engaging with her disappointment rather than dismissing it. "A considerable loss to the profession based on what I've observed of your skills." Again, the straightforward acknowledgement of her abilities warmed Eleanor in a way that elaborate compliments never could. Wyatt Blackwood might be a man of few words, but those he chose carried the weight of genuine assessment. "What of you?" she asked, turning the conversation. "You mentioned you studied medicine before the war." A shadow crossed Wyatt's face. "Briefly, 2 years at Harvard Medical School, following in my father's footsteps." "Your father was a doctor." "A surgeon of some renown in Boston," Wyatt confirmed. "He expected his eldest son to continue the family tradition." "But you chose a military career instead." "Not exactly chose," Wyatt corrected, his gaze returning to the maps. "When my parents died, medical school became impractical. My brothers needed support, and the family business, shipping, primarily required immediate attention. I took a commission in the Army because it offered both income and the prospect of advancement, while allowing me to arrange for my brother's education." Eleanor heard what remained unsaid, that Wyatt had set aside his own ambitions to ensure his brother's welfare, that his military service had been as much duty as choice. It explained much about the man before her: his sense of responsibility, his practical approach to problems, his careful stewardship of resources. "You never returned to medicine after the war?" she asked. "No." The single syllable carried finality, suggesting a door firmly closed. After a moment, he added, "Though I've maintained an interest, as you've seen from my medical supplies." Eleanor nodded, understanding that some paths once abandoned could not be reclaimed. She had felt the same about her own interrupted medical ambitions, a road not taken that sometimes haunted her thoughts during quiet moments. They fell into companionable silence, Wyatt returning his attention to the maps, while Eleanor examined the nearest bookshelf. Among the expected volumes on ranching, animal husbandry, and regional history, she was surprised to discover several medical texts, not just basic field manuals, but advanced works on anatomy, surgical techniques in disease treatment. Some showed signs of frequent use, their spines cracked, and pages marked with small paper slips. "These are recent additions," she observed, pulling out a volume on cardiac function, published just 3 years earlier. "You've kept your medical library current." Wyatt glanced up from the maps. Knowledge advances even when we don't pursue it professionally. I find the developments interesting. The admission revealed yet another layer to this complex man, a continued connection to the path he had been forced to abandon, an intellectual curiosity that extended beyond his daily responsibilities. Eleanor wondered how many others in Hollow Trace knew this side of Wyatt Blackwood, or whether he typically kept such interests private, as she had learned to do with her own. "May I?" she asked, holding up the cardiac text. Wyatt nodded. "Of course. Any of the books are yours to read while you're here." Eleanor settled into one of the leather chairs near the fire, the medical text open on her lap. For the next hour, they existed in comfortable silence. Wyatt working methodically on his route planning, Eleanor absorbed in the latest research on heart function and circulation. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the occasional turning of pages, and the soft scratch of Wyatt's pen on paper. It was a peaceful interlude unlike anything Eleanor had experienced since Daniel's death, not just the physical comfort of warmth and shelter, but the intellectual companionship of shared quiet concentration, the absence of need to explain or justify her interests. Eventually, Wyatt rolled up his maps and secured them with leather ties. "It's late," he observed, though his tone held no reproach. "The children will be awake early." Eleanor smiled at what had become a familiar refrain between them. "Yes, though I think Nathan may sleep later tomorrow after all his exertion with the snow clearing." "Perhaps." Wyatt's expression softened slightly. "He worked well today." Porter was impressed. "He tries so hard to be useful," Eleanor said, a hint of worry creeping into her voice. "Sometimes I fear he's forgotten how to simply be a boy." Wyatt considered this. "There's a creek on the property frozen solid now, but safe for skating. The hands cleared it last week for their day off. Nathan might enjoy it a chance to play rather than work." The suggestion surprised Eleanor not just for its thoughtfulness, but for the implicit understanding of what her son needed beyond practical tasks and responsibilities. "That's a wonderful idea," she agreed, "though I'm not sure he has ever skated before." "I could show him," Wyatt offered, then seemed almost startled by his own suggestion. "If that would be acceptable to you." Eleanor studied him, noting the slight tension in his jaw, as if he expected refusal or perhaps regretted the spontaneous offer. "I think Nathan would like that very much," she said softly. "Thank you." Wyatt nodded, once his expression returning to its usual reserve. "Good night then, Eleanor." "Good night, Wyatt." As she climbed the stairs to the Blue Room, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the gradual shift in their interactions over the past 2 weeks. From the initial wariness of strangers thrown together by circumstance, they had developed a tentative rapport based on mutual respect and shared interests. Not friendship exactly, Wyatt maintained too many barriers for that, but something more than mere coexistence under the same roof. The children were sleeping peacefully when she entered the room. Michael had kicked off his blankets as usual, his small limbs sprawled across the cradle in perfect abandon. Sophie had curled herself into a tight ball beneath her quilt, only the top of her head visible. And Nathan lay on his back, one arm flung outward, Michael's gloves placed carefully on the table beside his bed, treasured evidence of Wyatt's unexpected approval. Eleanor tucked Michael's blankets back around him, brushed a kiss across Sophie's forehead, and smoothed Nathan's tousled hair. The simple actions grounded her, reminding her why she continued to push forward despite loss and hardship. These children were her purpose, her legacy, her heart made visible. Yet as she prepared for bed, Eleanor acknowledged that something had changed within her as well during their time at Silver Creek. The constant fear and desperate focus on mere survival had eased, allowing other aspects of herself to reemerge: the intellect her father had nurtured, the healer her grandmother had trained, the woman who found satisfaction in meaningful work and thoughtful conversation. She had not expected to find these parts of herself again in the isolated ranch house of a man reputed to be cold and unapproachable. But Wyatt Blackwood was proving to be far more complex than town gossip suggested: a man of education and principle, beneath the stern exterior capable of unexpected kindness toward 3 fatherless children and their struggling mother. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last coherent thought was that spring seemed both too distant and too near, the uncertain future beyond Silver Creek Ranch, simultaneously a concern to be faced and a reality she was not yet ready to contemplate. The following days brought news from town that the illness was spreading, but responding well to the combined treatments Patterson had implemented. The doctor sent a brief note of thanks to Eleanor, mentioning specifically that the Cherokee remedies had proven particularly effective for the youngest patients. The acknowledgement, while gratifying, was less important to Eleanor than knowing her knowledge had helped ease suffering. Life at the ranch continued its winter rhythm, the isolation broken only by occasional visits from neighboring ranchers braving the snow to discuss spring breeding plans or share news from more distant settlements. These visitors regarded Eleanor and her children with barely concealed curiosity, clearly wondering about their presence in Wyatt's home, but too respectful, or perhaps too intimidated to ask direct questions. Wyatt himself maintained his reserved demeanor in company, but continued to show small kindnesses in private. He kept his promise to teach Nathan ice skating, spending an entire Saturday afternoon at the frozen creek, with both Nathan and Sophie returning with rosy-cheeked children who bubbled with excitement over their new skill. He found a box of carved wooden animals in the attic for Michael figures Wyatt claimed to have forgotten, but which Maria later confided had been made by his own father for Wyatt and his brothers. Most evenings after the children were asleep, Eleanor and Wyatt found themselves in the library, sometimes conversing, sometimes simply sharing the space in companionable silence. These quiet hours became a sanctuary of sorts for Eleanor, a time when she could engage her mind beyond the immediate concerns of motherhood and daily survival. It was during one such evening, nearly a month after their arrival at Silver Creek, that Wyatt broached a subject they had tacitly avoided. "Spring roundup begins in late March," he said, setting aside the book he had been reading. "8 weeks from now, weather permitting." Eleanor understood immediately the unspoken question beneath his statement. Their arrangement had been for shelter until spring, an imprecise time frame that now required definition. "I see," she said carefully, marking her place in the medical journal she had been studying. "We should discuss our plans." Wyatt nodded, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Do you intend to return to town?" The direct question deserved an equally direct answer, but Eleanor found herself hesitating. She had not allowed herself to think too concretely about their future beyond Silver Creek, focusing instead on the immediate needs of her children and their day-to-day existence. "I'm not certain," she admitted finally. "There's little for us in Hollow Trace now. No home, no employment prospects." She sighed. "I had thought perhaps Denver or Helena, somewhere large enough that my nursing skills might find use where the children could attend proper schools." Wyatt considered this, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of his chair, a rare outward sign of internal deliberation. "There's another possibility," he said after a moment. "You could remain here." Eleanor's breath caught. "Here at Silver Creek." "Yes." Wyatt's voice remained measured, practical. "Maria isn't getting any younger. She could use permanent assistance with the household. The children have settled well, and your medical knowledge would be valuable not just for the ranch hands, but potentially for neighboring homesteads as well." It was a logical proposal presented in terms of mutual benefit rather than charity. Yet Eleanor sensed there was more beneath the offer than Wyatt had articulated, some deeper motivation he was either unwilling or unable to express directly. "That's generous," she said carefully. "But I wouldn't want to impose further on your hospitality." "It wouldn't be imposition but employment," Wyatt clarified. "Room and board for you and the children, plus a fair wage for your work. A formal arrangement properly documented." The precision of the offer suggested he had given it considerable thought, perhaps even discussed the details with Porter or his business managers. It was not a spontaneous gesture, but a deliberate decision. "May I ask why Puye?" Eleanor questioned, watching his face closely. "There must be other housekeepers available, women without 3 children in tow." Wyatt met her gaze directly, his gray eyes revealing nothing of his emotions, but not flinching from her scrutiny. "Your children are an asset, not a liability. Nathan has a natural way with horses that Porter has remarked upon. Sophie brings life to rooms that have been silent too long. And Michael," he paused, something softening briefly in his expression, "Michael reminds me that the future still holds possibilities despite what we may have lost." The simple honesty of this statement moved Eleanor unexpectedly. It acknowledged what she had begun to suspect, that her children had somehow breached the walls Wyatt had built around himself after his wife's death, allowing him to reconnect with emotions he had suppressed for 3 years. "And me?" she asked softly. "What do I bring to Silver Creek besides household help and medical knowledge?" Wyatt's gaze remained steady. "Intelligence. Perspective. Conversation worth having. He hesitated, then added with careful precision, "Your presence makes this house feel less empty." It was perhaps the most personal statement he had ever made to her, all the more significant for coming from a man so guarded with his thoughts and feelings. Eleanor felt the weight of it settle between them, not a declaration of romantic interest, but an admission of human connection that Wyatt Blackwood did not grant easily or often. Before she could formulate a response, a sound from the hallway caught their attention, the creak of a floorboard, followed by a child's poorly stifled cough. Wyatt rose and opened the library door to reveal Nathan standing awkwardly in the corridor, his expression caught between embarrassment at being discovered and determination to complete whatever mission had brought him downstairs after bedtime. "Nathan," Eleanor said, moving to her son's side, "what are you doing out of bed?" The boy straightened his shoulders, facing Wyatt rather than his mother. "Sir, I wanted to ask you something important. Man to man." The formal phrasing might have seemed comical from a child under different circumstances, but Nathan's serious expression and the careful dignity with which he held himself demanded respect rather than amusement. Wyatt nodded gravely. "Very well. What did you wish to discuss?" Nathan glanced briefly at Eleanor, then back to Wyatt. "It's about spring, sir, when the snow melts." Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest, realizing that her son had likely overheard at least part of their conversation about future plans. She had tried to shield the children from uncertainty to maintain an appearance of confidence about their situation, but Nathan was perceptive beyond his years. "Go on," Wyatt encouraged when Nathan hesitated. "Mr. Porter said I could help with the spring roundup if I keep practicing with the horses," Nathan said in a rush. "But that's only if we're still here. And I heard you talking about Denver and Helena, and I thought maybe," he trailed off, his composure faltering. Eleanor knelt beside her son, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Nathan, we haven't made any decisions yet. Mr. Blackwood has offered us the opportunity to stay at Silver Creek, and we're discussing the possibilities." Hope flared in Nathan's eyes. "We could stay, really stay, not just until spring." "That's the offer," Wyatt confirmed, his tone softening slightly as he addressed the boy. "Your mother and I were just discussing the details." Nathan looked between them, a sudden maturity in his young face. "Is it because of my father? Because Mr. Blackwood feels bad about the mine?" The directness of the question startled both adults. Eleanor had never explicitly told her children about Wyatt's connection to Daniel's death, though she realized now that Nathan must have pieced it together from overheard conversations or comments from the ranch hands. Wyatt did not evade the difficult question. He crouched to Nathan's level, meeting the boy's gaze directly. "That was part of why I offered your family shelter initially," he acknowledged. "Your father suggested safety improvements that I rejected. When the accident happened, I felt responsible." Nathan absorbed this with a solemnity beyond his years. "Papa said sometimes the mine owners didn't listen because safety cost money." "He was right," Wyatt agreed quietly. "And it was a poor decision on my part, one I've regretted every day since." "But that's not why we'd stay now," Eleanor interjected gently, wanting to be honest with her son, but also to distinguish between initial guilt and their current situation. "Mr. Blackwood has offered me employment, real work with fair wages, not charity." Nathan considered this, his young brow furrowed in concentration. "So we wouldn't have to leave. This could be our home." The question hung in the air, laden with hope and fear, and the desperate need for stability after months of uncertainty. Eleanor looked to Wyatt, wondering how he would respond to such a direct appeal from a child who had already lost too much. "Silver Creek has room for all of you," Wyatt said carefully, "for as long as your mother chooses to stay. That's my offer." It was a measured response, neither overpromising nor dismissing Nathan's concerns. The qualification "for as long as your mother chooses" placed the decision squarely with Eleanor, respecting her authority as parent, while making clear the permanence of the invitation itself. Nathan turned to Eleanor, his eyes pleading. "Mama, can we stay? Please, I like it here. Sophie does too, and James is getting so much better, and I can help with the horses and learn ranching and—" "Nathan," Eleanor interrupted gently, "this is a serious decision that affects all of us. I need time to consider Mr. Blackwood's offer carefully." Seeing her son's face fall, she added, "But I promise I will take your wishes, all of your wishes, into account." The boy nodded reluctantly, accepting this partial answer, with the same maturity he had shown throughout their difficult months since Daniel's death. Yes, ma'am. Now back to bed, Eleanor instructed, kissing his forehead. It's late, and you have chores in the morning. Nathan turned to leave but paused in the doorway. Mr. Blackwood. Yes. Thank you for wanting us to stay. With that, he disappeared upstairs, his footsteps fading into the quiet house. Left alone again, Eleanor and Wyatt regarded each other in silence for a moment, the interrupted conversation now altered by Nathan's earnest intervention. Children have a way of clarifying matters, Wyatt observed finally. Yes, Eleanor agreed with a small smile, though not always at convenient times. His question was valid about your husband. Wyatt's expression remained serious. I know I never told the children the details of my connection to Daniel's death. Nathan must have overheard something. He's observant, Eleanor sighed, returning to her chair by the fire. Does it change your consideration of my offer? Knowing that guilt played a role initially, Wyatt considered the question honestly. Did it matter that Wyatt's first impulse to help them had been driven by remorse rather than pure altruism, that his offer of shelter might never have been extended if not for his indirect role in Daniel's death? No, she said finally. Whatever brought us to Silver Creek, what has happened since, how you've treated my children, the respect you've shown me, those things stand on their own merit. She met his gaze directly. And I believe in judging present actions rather than past motivations. Something in Wyatt's expression eased at her words, a slight relaxation around his eyes, a barely perceptible release of tension in his shoulders. Thank you for that. I haven't accepted your offer yet, Eleanor reminded him with gentle humor. No, he acknowledged, the ghost of a smile touching his lips, but you haven't refused it either. The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door, an unexpected sound in the quiet evening hours when the ranch was normally settled for the night. Wyatt frowned, moving immediately toward the hall with the alertness of a man accustomed to responding to potential threats. Eleanor followed, concern overriding propriety. Late visitors in winter usually meant emergencies, illness, injury, or worse. She reached the front door just as Wyatt was escorting a well-dressed man in his early 30s into the house. Behind them, two younger men who appeared to be ranch hands remained mounted, their expressions suggesting they would rather be anywhere else on this cold night. Mrs. Foster, Wyatt said as they entered, his tone controlled, but with an underlying tension that alarmed her. This is Jonathan Reed, clerk at Hollister's Bank. He's here on official business. The young man removed his hat, revealing sandy hair and an intelligent face marked by evident distress. Snow melted from his coat onto the polished floor, and his hands trembled. Whether from cold or anxiety wasn't immediately clear. Mrs. Foster, he acknowledged with a stiff nod. I apologize for the intrusion, but my visit couldn't wait until morning. Please come warm yourself, Eleanor said, gesturing toward the study. Maria can prepare coffee and something to eat. That's very kind, Reed replied, his gaze darting nervously toward the windows. But I shouldn't stay long. What I have to tell you, he hesitated, looking at Wyatt. It concerns Mr. Hollister and Mr. Mercer. They're planning something that threatens everything you have built here, Mr. Blackwood. Wyatt's expression grew grave. Come into the study. We'll talk there. As Reed followed Wyatt, Eleanor caught the clerk's whispered words. You don't understand. They're coming for the children first. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter night swept through Eleanor as she closed the door against the darkness. Whatever sanctuary they had found at Silver Creek, it seemed their respite was about to end. Wyatt ushered Jonathan Reed into the study, his face grave. The banker's clerk's snow-covered boots left small puddles on the polished floor as he followed, his hands still trembling despite the warmth of the house. Eleanor instructed Maria to prepare coffee, then joined the men, closing the study door behind her. Now, Mr. Reed, Wyatt said as they settled near the fire, explain what brings you out in such weather at this hour. Reed removed his gloves, revealing reddened fingers that he flexed nervously. I work for Edwin Hollister at the bank, as you know. I've been his clerk for 3 years. Yes, Wyatt nodded. You've handled some of my business correspondence. I have. Reed glanced toward the windows as if expecting to see someone watching. But that's not why I'm here. I've discovered something terrible. Mr. Hollister and George Mercer are planning to petition the territorial court to have you declared mentally incompetent. Eleanor felt a jolt of surprise. The accusation seemed so outlandish that her first instinct was to dismiss it. On what grounds? Wyatt asked, his voice deceptively calm. Only the slight narrowing of his eyes betrayed his reaction. Your changed behavior since Mrs. Blackwood's death. Reed replied, his gaze flicking briefly to Eleanor, specifically taking in Mrs. Foster and her children. They're calling it evidence of diminished judgment, claiming grief has affected your ability to manage your affairs rationally. Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Their presence, her children's presence, was being used as a weapon against the man who had offered them shelter in their darkest hour. I see, Wyatt said, betraying no emotion beyond cool assessment. And how do you come to have this information, Mr. Reed? I'm Hollister's clerk. I've been typing the legal documents, making copies of correspondence. Reed straightened in his chair, finding his courage. Some of the documents are forgeries, altered financial records designed to show erratic business decisions over the past year. Others are testimonies from townspeople about your isolation after your wife's death, followed by the sudden acceptance of strangers into your home. Maria returned with coffee, setting the tray down with unusual force that betrayed her distress at overhearing Reed's words. She shot the young man a suspicious look before departing, though Eleanor noted she left the study door ajar, likely to hear more of the conversation. Wyatt poured coffee for Reed, his movements deliberate and controlled. Why are you telling me this? Betraying your employer carries significant risk. Reed accepted the cup with still trembling hands. My sister worked for the Mercer family 2 years ago. When she refused George Mercer's advances, she was dismissed without references. She couldn't find work afterward. Had to leave the territory. Bitterness edged his voice. Hollister did nothing, said it wasn't his concern how Mercer managed his household. And now you seek revenge, Wyatt observed. Justice, Reed corrected firmly. What they're doing to you isn't right, using the courts to steal what they can't earn. What do they hope to gain? Eleanor asked. Surely they can't simply take Mr. Blackwood's property. Reed turned to her, seeming to truly notice her presence for the first time. Not directly, ma'am, but if Mr. Blackwood is declared incompetent, the court will appoint a guardian to manage his affairs. Hollister has already suggested George Mercer for that role. Convenient, Wyatt remarked dryly. There's more, Reed continued. The Denver and Pacific Railroad has been negotiating for a right-of-way through this region. Their preferred route crosses a corner of Silver Creek Ranch. Understanding dawned in Wyatt's eyes. And I've refused their offers. Yes, sir. But if Mercer were managing your affairs, he'd sell the right-of-way for a fraction of its value, with Hollister arranging the financing and taking his cut. Reed finished. A neat arrangement for everyone except me, Wyatt said, his calm calculation impressive to Eleanor. Where many men might have exploded in rage at such a plot, he approached it as a strategic problem to be solved, assessing motivations, anticipating moves, considering the countermeasures. How far along are their preparations, he asked. They've been gathering signatures for the petition for 2 weeks, Reed replied, and they've been meeting with Judge Wilson privately. I believe they've influenced him financially. Bribed him, you mean, Eleanor said bluntly. Reed nodded, looking miserable. The judge has gambling debts. Hollister holds the notes. Wyatt rose and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape now silvered by moonlight. His reflection in the glass revealed nothing of his thoughts, but the tension in his shoulders spoke of contained anger. When do they plan to file the petition? He asked without turning. After the next circuit court session in 3 weeks, Reed answered. Judge Wilson will issue a temporary order granting Mercer oversight of Silver Creek, while the competency hearing is scheduled, likely for late March, just before Roundup begins. The timing was strategic, Eleanor realized. With spring Roundup approaching a critical period that determined much of the ranch's annual income, Wyatt would be at his most vulnerable to disruption. Do you have proof of these forgeries? Wyatt asked, turning back to face them. Documents I could use to challenge their petition. Reed reached into his coat and withdrew a small oilskin packet. Copies of the originals and the forgeries. Not everything, but enough to show deliberate fraud. He hesitated. I can't testify publicly. If Hollister knew I'd betrayed him, your assistance will remain confidential, Wyatt assured him. He accepted the packet, examining its contents briefly before securing it in a desk drawer. You've taken considerable risk bringing this information, Mr. Reed. I won't forget it. The young clerk seemed to relax slightly at this acknowledgement. What will you do, sir? Counter their moves before they make them, Wyatt replied with grim determination. Prepare a defense while they believe I'm unaware of their plans. Eleanor admired his strategic thinking, even as concern grew within her. This threat was partly, perhaps largely, because of her family's presence at Silver Creek. Their situation, which had finally begun to stabilize, was once again precarious. After ensuring Reed had warmed himself sufficiently, Wyatt arranged for Porter to escort the young man safely back to town along a route that would avoid observation. Only when they were alone again in the study did Wyatt allow his carefully maintained composure to slip, his expression hardening with cold anger. "I apologize," he said to Eleanor, surprising her. "It seems your family has been drawn into a conflict not of your making." "Our presence provided them ammunition," Eleanor acknowledged, "but the plot would likely have proceeded regardless, just with different justification." Wyatt nodded, acknowledging the truth of her assessment. Hollister has coveted Silver Creek for years, and the railroad's interest creates opportunity too tempting for men like him to resist. "What will you do?" Eleanor asked, echoing Reed's earlier question, but with the deeper concern of someone whose future was now entangled with Wyatt's. Wyatt was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as he considered options and strategies. When he spoke, his voice carried the decisive tone of a military commander. "First, secure evidence of my mental competence, medical evaluations, business records showing consistent decision-making. Second, gather counter-testimonies from respected community members. Third, prepare legal challenges to their forged documents." He glanced at Eleanor. "And I should formalize your position here with a proper employment contract backdated to your arrival. Remove any suggestion of impropriety or irrational charity." The methodical approach reassured Eleanor somewhat, though doubt lingered. "Will it be enough if the judge is already compromised?" "Perhaps not through conventional legal channels alone," Wyatt admitted. "Which is why I need to contact my brother Robert in Boston. His business connections extend to the territorial governor's office. Political pressure may be necessary." Eleanor nodded, understanding the multi-layered approach, legal, social, and political defenses working in concert. Yet one aspect of the situation remained unaddressed. "Wyatt," she said carefully, "we should discuss whether my family's continued presence helps or hinders your position. If we were to leave, no." The word was sharp, definitive. Wyatt's expression softened slightly at Eleanor's startled look. "Your departure now would only validate their narrative, suggest that there was indeed something improper about your presence here that couldn't withstand scrutiny." "But if it would simplify your defense—" "It wouldn't," he interrupted again, then visibly collected himself. "Eleanor, this attack was likely inevitable. Hollister has been watching for vulnerability since Elizabeth died. Your family may have provided a convenient pretext, but removing that pretext won't deter him from his ultimate goal." The logic was sound, yet Eleanor sensed something beyond strategic calculation in Wyatt's insistence. Perhaps the same sentiment that had prompted his offer of permanent employment earlier that evening. The realization that he genuinely wanted them to stay, that their presence had become important to him beyond practical considerations, stirred complicated emotions she wasn't prepared to examine. "Very well," she said finally, "but I want to help. This concerns my family as much as it does you." Wyatt studied her for a moment and then nodded. "Your assistance would be valuable, particularly with gathering testimonies from town. Patterson respects you, and after your help with the recent illness, others may be more inclined to listen." "I'll need to return to town then," Eleanor concluded. "Speak with people directly." "Yes, though not alone." Wyatt's protective instinct was evident in his tone. "Hollister and Mercer have influence there. Best not to appear vulnerable." The discussion continued late into the night as they formulated plans and contingencies. Eleanor was impressed by Wyatt's strategic thinking, his ability to anticipate opponents' moves, identify weaknesses in their position, and develop multi-layered counter-strategies. It was clear he had been a formidable military officer, and those skills remained sharp despite years of civilian life. By the time they finally retired, the first pale hints of dawn were appearing on the horizon. Eleanor paused at the door to the Blue Room, listening to her children's peaceful breathing within. The threat to their newfound stability weighed heavily upon her. Yet she found herself oddly invigorated by the challenge ahead. After months of passive endurance, accepting charity, weathering judgment, surviving day to day, it felt empowering to take active steps against those who would harm her family. And Wyatt was now undeniably part of that family, not by blood or marriage, but by choice and circumstance. The realization should have frightened her, but instead brought a curious sense of rightness, as if pieces long adrift had finally found their proper alignment. The next morning brought practical implementations of their late-night planning. Wyatt dispatched riders to his attorney in Helena and to the telegraph office with an urgent message for Robert in Boston. Eleanor sat at the study desk, drafting a formal employment contract with Wyatt's guidance, detailing her responsibilities as household manager and medical assistant with appropriate compensation. "This looks quite official," she remarked, reviewing the final document with its precise language and multiple clauses. "It needs to be," Wyatt replied, his expression serious. "We're creating a paper trail that will withstand legal scrutiny." The pragmatic necessity didn't diminish the significance of the moment for Eleanor. This contract represented more than protection against Hollister's scheme. It was tangible evidence of her value, her skills, her ability to provide for her children through meaningful work rather than charity or dependence. Wyatt seemed to understand the emotional weight beneath the practical document. As she signed her name with a flourish, he said quietly, "This merely formalizes what was already true. Your contributions to Silver Creek have been evident from the beginning." Before Eleanor could respond to this unexpected affirmation, Maria appeared at the study door, her expression uncharacteristically anxious. "Senor Judge Wilson has arrived. He says it's urgent." Wyatt and Eleanor exchanged concerned glances. They hadn't expected official action so soon. A return so quickly suggested potentially worse news. They found the judge in the main hall removing his snow-covered coat. Wilson looked better than during Reed's description, his eyes clearer, his hands steadier, his complexion healthier. The improvement in his physical condition made the gravity of his expression all the more concerning. "Blackwood," he greeted, nodding to Wyatt before turning to Eleanor. "Mrs. Foster Good, you are both here. I have information you need to know." Wyatt led them into the parlor where Maria had already prepared coffee and a light breakfast. Once they were seated, Wilson came directly to the point. "Hollister and Mercer are moving against you, Blackwood. They're gathering signatures on a petition to have you declared mentally unfit using your decision to take in Mrs. Foster and her children as primary evidence." "We're aware," Wyatt replied calmly. "The information reached us last night." Wilson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You have sources in town I don't know about." "Let's say concerned citizens recognize injustice when they see it," Wyatt answered diplomatically. "What else can you tell us?" Wilson leaned forward, lowering his voice though they were alone in the parlor. "They've approached me twice now asking for medical testimony about your mental state, suggesting that grief can cause decision-making impairment, particularly in men of your forceful nature." "And your response?" Wyatt's tone revealed nothing of the significance this question held for their defense. Wilson straightened, a flash of professional pride crossing his face. "I informed them that as I had not conducted a formal evaluation, I could offer no medical opinion on your mental competence, and that based on our recent interactions regarding the town's illness, you appeared entirely rational and sound of judgment to me." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward the judge. His support, particularly as the town's only judicial authority, would be invaluable in countering Hollister's narrative. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Your professional assessment carries significant weight." Wilson acknowledged this with a nod. "They didn't appreciate my position. Hollister implied rather strongly that my outstanding debts at his bank might require immediate settlement if I couldn't find my way to a different medical conclusion." "Threats, then," Wyatt observed, his expression darkening. "Not unexpected, but useful to document." "There's more," Wilson continued. "They're also building a case against Mrs. Foster's fitness as a mother." Eleanor felt as if she'd been struck. "What?" "They're suggesting that a proper mother wouldn't expose her children to potential impropriety by living unchaperoned in a bachelor's home." Wilson explained his disgust with this line of attack, evident in his tone. "Hollister has been speaking with Judge Wilson about the possibility of removing the children temporarily while your situation is evaluated." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. After everything they had endured, Daniel's death, poverty near starvation, to face losing her children over manufactured moral concerns, seemed beyond bearing. That's absurd," she managed, her voice tight with controlled fury. "My children have separate quarters. Maria serves as chaperone. There's been nothing improper whatsoever." "I know that," Wilson assured her. "But Hollister is weaving a compelling narrative for those inclined to judge harshly. A vulnerable widow, a wealthy bachelor, 3 children as innocent victims. It appeals to the moral guardians of Hollow Trace. Wyatt's expression had hardened to granite. They won't touch the children, he stated with absolute certainty. I'll ensure it. The conviction in his voice steadied Eleanor somewhat, though the threat to her family remained terrifyingly real. She had heard of children removed from mothers deemed unfit by moral standards, rather than actual care capabilities, children placed in orphanages or with foster families, sometimes never to be reunited with their biological parents. What do you recommend, Judge Wilson? She asked, fighting to maintain composure. Wilson considered the question carefully. A preemptive move might be advisable. Perhaps a formal arrangement that clarifies your position here, employment rather than charity, and possibly, he hesitated, glancing between them, a more permanent solution to the propriety question. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Marriage would indeed solve the propriety concerns in one stroke, placing the children under Wyatt's legal protection, while providing Eleanor with the social standing of a respectable married woman rather than a potentially compromised widow. Wyatt's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts on this suggestion. We've already addressed the employment question, he said, indicating the signed contract on the side table. As for more permanent arrangements, those would require careful consideration by all parties. His diplomatic response neither embraced nor rejected the possibility Wilson had raised, maintaining flexibility while they assessed all options. Eleanor was grateful for his restraint. Such a significant step taken purely for legal protection would require serious discussion in private. What else can you tell us about their preparations? Wyatt asked, steering the conversation back to immediate tactical concerns. They've been meeting regularly at Hollister's home after banking hours, Wilson replied. Mercer, Judge Wilson, and occasionally Reverend Brooks, though I believe the Reverend is merely seeking information rather than actively participating. They've been collecting statements from townspeople about your changed behavior since Mrs. Blackwood's death. And people are providing these statements? Eleanor asked, disturbed by the thought of an entire community turning against Wyatt. Wilson sighed. Some willingly, some under subtle pressure. Hollister holds mortgages on half the businesses in town. Mercer employs many seasonal workers who need his goodwill to secure positions, and some simply enjoy participating in another's downfall. Human nature at its least admirable. Wyatt absorbed this information with the same strategic calculation he had shown the previous night. We need our own testimonies, people willing to attest to my sound judgment and Mrs. Foster's excellent maternal care. I can provide a formal medical assessment, Wilson offered immediately, and speak to my recent observations of the children's health and well-being. Thank you, Wyatt acknowledged. We'll need others as well. Reverend Brooks might be approachable if, as you suggest, he's not fully committed to their scheme. The conversation continued, outlining potential allies and approaches. Wilson provided valuable insight into the town's social dynamics, who might be sympathetic to their cause, who was firmly in Hollister's camp, who might be persuaded with the right incentives or appeals. By the time the judge departed, promising to return with his formal medical assessment in 2 days, Eleanor felt marginally more hopeful. The threats remained serious, but they were no longer facing them blindly. Knowledge, as her father had often told her, was the first step toward effective action. Wyatt walked Wilson to the door, exchanging a few private words before returning to the parlor where Eleanor waited. His expression was grim but determined. Well, she asked. Wilson believes they'll move against us within the week, Wyatt replied, possibly attempting to take the children first, using that as leverage to force compliance with the competency evaluation. Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white with tension. I won't let them take my children. Nor will I, Wyatt promised, his voice carrying absolute conviction. He paused, then added more carefully, Eleanor, we should discuss Wilson's suggestion about a more permanent arrangement. She had been expecting this, yet still felt unprepared for the conversation. Marriage, you mean? Yes. Wyatt maintained his direct gaze, neither flinching from the topic nor pressuring for a particular response. It would resolve the propriety concerns immediately and place the children under my legal protection as stepfather. It would also bind you permanently to a family not your own. A significant commitment made under duress rather than other considerations, Eleanor pointed out. Wyatt considered this thoughtfully. True, though I would argue that the past weeks have demonstrated considerable compatibility between our families, pressure notwithstanding. The careful phrasing revealed nothing of his personal feelings on the matter, whether he might welcome such a union beyond its practical benefits or merely tolerate it as a necessary legal maneuver. Eleanor found herself unexpectedly disappointed by this neutrality, though she couldn't articulate precisely why. The children would need to be consulted, she said instead, particularly Nathan. He still feels strongly connected to Daniel's memory. Of course, Wyatt agreed. Their welfare must be paramount in any decision. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Nathan and Sophie returning from morning chores with rosy cheeks and excited chatter about a nest of barn kittens they had discovered. The serious discussion was set aside, though Eleanor caught Wyatt watching the children with a thoughtful expression that suggested he was considering how to approach the delicate subject with them. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity as they implemented their defensive strategies. Wyatt dispatched Porter to neighboring ranches to secure supporting statements from respected cattlemen who had conducted business with him for years. Eleanor drafted letters to former colleagues from her nursing days who could attest to her character and maternal competence. By evening, the initial shock had transformed into purposeful action, the household mobilized against the threat to their shared security. After the children were asleep, Eleanor and Wyatt once again convened in the library to assess their progress and plan next steps. "Robert has responded," Wyatt announced, holding up a telegram that had arrived by rider late in the afternoon. "He's contacting the governor's office and will arrive personally within the week." "That's encouraging," Eleanor acknowledged. "Family support will strengthen your position considerably." Wyatt's expression suggested the relationship was more complicated than simple support. "Robert and I have had our differences over the years, but he understands the importance of family legacy, if nothing else." The qualified statement hinted at tensions Eleanor had suspected, but Wyatt had never directly addressed his role as eldest brother. Forced to become parent and provider at a young age, had clearly created complex dynamics with his siblings, relationships shaped by responsibility and authority rather than mere fraternal affection. "Tell me about him," she suggested, sensing Wyatt might benefit from discussing the impending reunion. "What should I expect?" Wyatt considered this, absently turning the telegram between his fingers. "Robert is driven, ambitious, brilliant with financial matters, but sometimes blind to human considerations. He's built the family shipping business into an empire that would have astonished our father." "You sound proud of him," Eleanor observed. "I am," Wyatt acknowledged, "though we approach life very differently. Robert believes in acquisition of wealth, influence, connections. I've preferred," he paused, searching for the right words, "sufficiency, having enough rather than always seeking more." The distinction revealed much about Wyatt's character, his preference for Silver Creek's isolated self-sufficiency over Boston's social and financial opportunities, his simple habits despite considerable wealth, his measured approach to all aspects of life. "Will he help?" Eleanor asked, returning to the practical concern at hand. "Yes," Wyatt replied with certainty. "Robert protects what belongs to the Montgomery family, and Silver Creek is still technically family property, though I've managed it independently for years. He won't allow Hollister and his schemes to threaten the family holdings." The conversation shifted to preparations for Robert's arrival and continued strategic planning. It was near midnight when they finally conceded to exhaustion, the day's tensions and activities taking their toll. As Eleanor rose to retire, Wyatt spoke with uncharacteristic hesitation. "I've been thinking about how to discuss the possible arrangement with the children. Perhaps it would be best, coming from you initially, to gauge their reactions before I become involved in the conversation." The consideration for her children's feelings touched Eleanor deeply. Many men in Wyatt's position would have expected compliance rather than consultation, viewing children, particularly those not biologically his, as subjects to be informed rather than participants to be engaged. "Thank you," she said softly. "I think that's wise. I'll speak with them tomorrow." Wyatt nodded, his expression revealing a rare vulnerability. "I would not wish to replace their father in their memories, Eleanor, only to provide protection and support where needed." The simple statement, delivered without pretense or calculation, pierced Eleanor's carefully maintained emotional barriers. For months, she had focused exclusively on practical concerns, food, shelter, safety for her children, deliberately suppressing deeper emotional needs for connection and companionship. Now confronted with Wyatt's understated decency, those suppressed feelings threatened to surface. "Good night, Wyatt," she managed withdrawing before her composure could fracture further. In the blue room, she found her children sleeping peacefully, unaware of the threats gathering around them, or the difficult conversations that awaited. Eleanor watched them for a long moment, Nathan's serious face relaxed in sleep. Sophie's arm flung dramatically across her pillow, Michael's tiny hand curled around the wooden horse Wyatt had given him. They had found safety and stability at Silver Creek. More than that, they had found acceptance, purpose, even happiness after months of desperate struggle. The thought of losing this newfound security to Hollister's scheming filled Eleanor with a cold fury unlike anything she had experienced before. Whatever it took, legal maneuvering, political pressure, even marriage if necessary, she would protect her children in the sanctuary they had found in Wyatt Blackwood's home. Not just for their sake, but for Wyatt's as well, she realized with sudden clarity. Somewhere in the weeks since their arrival, his welfare had become as important to her as her own family's, their futures inexplicably, perhaps inevitably intertwined. Eleanor woke the next morning to the sound of horses in the yard, multiple riders arriving with an urgency that sent her hurrying to the window. Below, she saw Wyatt striding toward them, three mounted men, Porter beside him, with a rifle held casually but visibly in his arms. Heart racing, she dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, instructing Maria to keep the children upstairs until she returned. The tension in the household was palpable, with ranch hands positioned strategically around the property in a manner that suggested Wyatt had anticipated potential trouble. She reached the front door just as Wyatt was escorting a well-dressed man in his early 60s into the house. Behind them, two younger men who appeared to be deputies remained mounted, their expressions suggesting they would rather be anywhere else on this cold morning. "Mrs. Foster," Wyatt said as they entered, his tone controlled, but with an underlying tension that alarmed her. "May I present Judge Anderson from the Territorial Court? He's here on official business." The judge removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair and a face that might once have commanded respect, but now showed the ravages of what Eleanor recognized as long-term alcohol abuse, broken veins across his nose, yellowish complexion, slightly trembling hands despite the early hour. "Mrs. Foster," he acknowledged with a stiff nod, "I apologize for the early intrusion, but my duties require prompt attention." "Of course," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level despite the dread building within her. "How may we assist you, Judge Anderson?" The judge cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with his task, despite his attempt at official dignity. "I have received concerning reports regarding the welfare of your children, ma'am. Specifically questions about the propriety of their current living situation." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, but she maintained a calm facade. "My children are excellently cared for, Judge Anderson. They have proper accommodations, nutrition, education, and medical attention far better than was available to them in town after my husband's death." Anderson shifted uncomfortably. "Be that as it may, there are questions of moral atmosphere that must be addressed. Children require proper examples, appropriate boundaries." "Perhaps you'd care to inspect their accommodations," Wyatt interrupted smoothly. "See for yourself the separate quarters, the educational materials, the improvements in their health since arriving here." It was a tactical move, forcing Anderson to actually observe the children's conditions, rather than relying on Hollister's characterizations. The judge seemed taken aback by the suggestion. "That won't be necessary at this juncture," he hedged. "My current duty is simply to inform Mrs. Foster of the petition that has been filed concerning her parental fitness, and to advise her that an evaluation will be conducted within the week." "A petition filed by whom exactly?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Anderson avoided her direct gaze. "Several concerned citizens of Hollow Trace, led by Mr. Edwin Hollister as a representative of community standards." "The same Mr. Hollister who holds the notes on your gambling debts?" Wyatt inquired with deceptive mildness. The judge's head snapped up, shock and guilt flashing across his face before he could compose himself. That's an outrageous accusation, Blackwood. One that borders on contempt of court." "Is it inaccurate?" Wyatt pressed, his voice still calm but unyielding. Anderson's discomfort was now painfully evident. He had clearly not expected to be confronted so directly with his compromised position. Before he could formulate a response, the front door opened again, admitting a blast of cold air and a man whose resemblance to Wyatt was unmistakable, despite their different coloring and attire. Robert Blackwood surveyed the scene with sharp eyes, taking in the judge's discomfort and the tension between the other participants. Where Wyatt's presence commanded respect through quiet authority, Robert exuded the confident power of a man accustomed to boardrooms and political maneuvering. "Judge Anderson," he said, advancing with hand extended, "Robert Blackwood of Blackwood Shipping. I believe you have corresponded with Governor Williams regarding the Territorial Development Committee." The judge's expression transformed from discomfort to alarm. "Mr. Blackwood, I wasn't aware you were in the territory." "Just arrived," Robert replied smoothly. "Urgent family business. I see I'm interrupting a legal matter." Anderson's gaze darted between the Blackwood brothers, clearly reassessing his position in light of this unexpected development. A routine notification only. Nothing that cannot be addressed through proper channels at a more convenient time. "Excellent," Robert smiled without warmth. "Then perhaps you'll join us for breakfast. I'm eager to discuss the governor's new initiative for judicial oversight in the territories. Fascinating developments in accountability measures." It was a masterful maneuver, simultaneously offering hospitality while delivering a thinly veiled warning about judicial scrutiny. Anderson's already pallid complexion paled further. "Another time, perhaps," he demurred, backing toward the door. "Duties in town require my immediate attention. Mrs. Foster, consider yourself officially notified of the pending evaluation. Mr. Blackwood." "Both Mr. Blackwoods, good day." With that hasty retreat, the judge departed, the sound of horses galloping away, suggesting his deputies were equally eager to leave Silver Creek behind. The three remaining adults stood in momentary silence, absorbing what had just occurred. It was Robert who spoke first, turning to his brother with a raised eyebrow. "Well, Wyatt, I see you've managed to embroil yourself in quite the situation since my last visit." Wyatt accepted this assessment with a slight nod. "Your timing is impeccable as always, Robert, though earlier than expected. I caught the overnight stage from Helena after receiving your telegram." Robert turned his attention to Eleanor, assessing her with the same penetrating gaze Wyatt sometimes employed. "And this must be Mrs. Foster, the supposed evidence of your mental decline." Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting his evaluation directly. "I am Mr. Blackwood, though I prefer to think of myself as household manager and medical assistant as my employment contract specifies." A flicker of approval crossed Robert's face. "Direct and professional. Excellent. Perhaps my brother's judgment isn't as compromised as Hollister suggests." Wyatt's expression softened marginally as he looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Foster has been an invaluable addition to Silver Creek, her children as well." The simple statement carried more weight than elaborate praise might have, and Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest despite the tension of the moment. Even now, with their situation increasingly precarious, Wyatt's quiet affirmation remained constant. "So I gather," Robert replied, glancing between them with shrewd assessment. "Now shall we discuss strategy? Anderson's retreat suggests Hollister's coalition is less solid than they'd like us to believe." They moved to the study where Maria had already arranged coffee and a light breakfast. As they settled, Robert's businesslike demeanor shifted to genuine concern. "The situation is serious, Wyatt. Hollister has been thorough in building his case, financial records suggesting erratic decisions, testimonies about your isolation after Elizabeth's death. Your sudden acceptance of Mrs. Foster's family presented as evidence of impaired judgment." "We're aware of the general approach," Wyatt acknowledged. "What we lack is detailed knowledge of their legal strategy and timeline." Robert nodded, accepting coffee from Maria with a distracted nod of thanks. "The petition for competency evaluation has already been filed with the territorial court. Anderson was supposed to deliver formal notice today, though your direct questioning seems to have rattled him." "And the children?" Eleanor asked, unable to contain her most pressing concern. "Judge Anderson mentioned a petition regarding parental fitness." Robert's expression grew grimmer. "Filed yesterday. They're moving quickly, likely hoping to create leverage through the children before addressing Wyatt's competency directly." The confirmation of her worst fears sent a chill through Eleanor. "How much time do we have?" "Very little," Robert admitted. "The hearing on temporary custody is scheduled for tomorrow morning in Hollow Trace." "Tomorrow?" Eleanor's voice rose in disbelief. "That's barely enough time to prepare a defense." "Which is precisely the point," Robert observed. "Hollister is forcing a crisis, creating circumstances where hasty decisions become necessary." Wyatt had remained silent during this exchange, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Now he looked up, decision evident in his eyes. "We'll need to accelerate our plans," he said simply. "Robert, can you remain for several days? Your presence adds considerable weight to our position." "Of course," his brother replied without hesitation. "I've cleared my calendar for the week, and I've taken the liberty of bringing Franklin Morris, our family attorney from Boston. He's securing rooms in town as we speak." Wyatt nodded his appreciation. "Wilson will provide his medical assessment this afternoon. Porter has collected statements from neighboring ranchers attesting to my continued sound business practices." "Good," Robert approved. "We'll need everything available for tomorrow's hearing. Hollister will have prepared carefully. We must match or exceed his preparation." Throughout this exchange, Eleanor noted the easy coordination between the brothers. Despite Wyatt's earlier comments about their differences, they clearly functioned as an effective team when facing external threats. "There's one matter we haven't addressed," Wyatt said, turning to Eleanor. "The most direct resolution to both the propriety concerns and the custody petition would be marriage." Robert's eyebrows rose, but he quickly masked his surprise with professional assessment. "Legally sound. A marriage would make the propriety question moot and establish Wyatt as stepfather with legal standing equal to Hollister's community concern. It would need to happen before tomorrow's hearing to be effective." Wyatt added, his tone remaining practical rather than pressuring, which meant today. The suddenness of the proposal, couched in strategic terms rather than romantic ones, should have felt cold or calculating. Yet Eleanor recognized the consideration beneath Wyatt's pragmatic approach. He was offering the most effective protection available while respecting her agency in the decision. "I haven't yet discussed the possibility with the children," she said, thinking aloud rather than objecting. "Though given the accelerated timeline, perhaps a compromise," Robert suggested. "A private ceremony today for legal purposes, followed by a more formal celebration later, when circumstances allow, one that would include the children's participation and community acknowledgement." It was a sensible solution to the immediate tactical problem. Yet Eleanor hesitated, not because she objected to marriage with Wyatt, a possibility she had been contemplating with increasing warmth since their conversation in the library, but because such a significant step taken under duress felt somehow diminished. "Wyatt," she said carefully, "I would not have you enter such a commitment purely as a legal maneuver. Marriage should be," she paused, searching for the right words, "more than strategy." Something softened in Wyatt's expression, a rare vulnerability, visible only to those who knew him well. "It would be," he said simply. The three words conveyed more than a lengthy declaration might have, especially coming from a man so careful with emotional expression. They acknowledged that whatever practical benefits marriage might offer, Wyatt's motivation extended beyond mere strategy. Robert cleared his throat, seemingly torn between tactical impatience and respect for the personal moment unfolding before him. "Perhaps I should check on the preparations for Judge Anderson's inevitable return," he suggested, rising from his chair. "The timing of any arrangements can be determined once we've assessed all available options." With that diplomatic exit, he left Eleanor and Wyatt alone in the study, the weight of their potential decision hanging between them. "I would understand if you preferred to fight through legal channels alone," Wyatt said after a moment. "Marriage is significant, not to be undertaken lightly, even in difficult circumstances." Eleanor studied him carefully, noting the tension in his jaw, the careful neutrality he was attempting to maintain, despite the personal stakes of their discussion. In that moment, she realized that Wyatt Blackwood, for all his strength, his strategic mind, his quiet authority, was as vulnerable to rejection as any man. "I have considered marriage between us before today," she admitted softly. "Not merely as a legal solution, but as a natural progression of our relationship." Wyatt's expression shifted subtly, surprise followed by cautious hope. "As have I," he acknowledged, "though I would have preferred a less pressured timeline for such discussions." The simple admission eased something in Eleanor's chest, the fear that she alone had been developing deeper feelings during their weeks together, that Wyatt's consideration of marriage remained purely practical, despite his care for her children. Perhaps, she suggested, finding unexpected calm amidst the crisis. "We might view today's necessity as accelerating an outcome already in motion rather than forcing one that wouldn't otherwise occur." Wyatt's lips curved in the closest thing to a true smile she had yet seen from him. "An excellent perspective as always, Eleanor." The moment of connection was interrupted by a commotion from upstairs. the unmistakable sounds of children awakening and beginning their day blissfully unaware of the momentous decisions being made below. I should speak with them, Eleanor said, rising from her chair. They deserve to understand what is happening, even if the full explanation must wait for calmer times. Wyatt nodded, his expression growing serious once more. Of course, would you prefer to speak with them alone first? Initially, yes, she decided, but I think you should join us afterward. If we're to become a family in truth, as well as law, they should hear from both of us. A family in truth. Wyatt repeated the words, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Yes, Eleanor said softly. I believe that's what we've been building these past weeks, whether we recognized it fully or not. As she climbed the stairs to her children, she felt an unexpected sense of rightness amidst the turmoil of their situation. The decision before them was being forced by external threats, yet it aligned with feelings that had been developing naturally, feelings she had been reluctant to acknowledge even to herself. She found Nathan already dressed and helping Sophie with her hair, while Michael played contentedly with wooden blocks on the floor. The domestic scene, evidence of her children's adaptation to their new circumstances, strengthened her resolve to protect what they had built together at Silver Creek. Good morning, she greeted them, receiving sleepy smiles in return. I need to talk with you all about something important. Nathan immediately sensed the gravity beneath her casual tone. Is something wrong, Mama? I heard horses earlier. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, gathering her thoughts. How did one explain to children that their family's future hung in the balance, that strangers were attempting to separate them for reasons that had nothing to do with love or care, but with power and greed? There are some people in town who don't understand our arrangement here at Silver Creek, she began carefully. They're concerned about us living in Mr. Blackwood's home without proper formalities. What does that mean? Sophie asked, abandoning her half-braided hair to climb onto Eleanor's lap. It means they think it's improper for a widow and her children to live with a single man, even though Mr. Blackwood has been nothing but respectful and kind to us. Nathan's expression darkened with understanding beyond his years. They think bad things about you and Mr. Blackwood, he concluded bluntly, even though they're not true. Yes, Eleanor acknowledged, seeing no point in shielding him from a truth he had already grasped. And because of these concerns, they're asking the judge to investigate whether you children are in a suitable environment. Would they want to take us away? Nathan's voice rose in alarm, causing Michael to look up from his blocks with sudden concern. They're trying to, Eleanor confirmed, maintaining calm despite her inner turmoil. But Mr. Blackwood and I are working to prevent that. We have a plan. Sophie's small arms tightened around Eleanor's neck. I don't want to leave. I like it here. Mr. Blackwood reads me stories, and Maria teaches me Spanish, and there are kittens in the barn. The simple, heartfelt objection brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. I know, sweetheart. I don't want to leave either. What's the plan? Nathan demanded, his young face set with determination. How do we stop them? Eleanor took a deep breath, approaching the central point of her explanation. Mr. Blackwood has suggested that we formalize our arrangement in a way that would address the town's concerns and protect our family. He has asked me to marry him. The statement hung in the air, three children processing its implications with varying levels of comprehension. Michael, too young to fully understand, returned to his blocks with contented ignorance. Sophie's eyes widened with surprise, while Nathan's expression grew complicated, concern, confusion, and something like cautious hope battling across his features. Marry, Sophie repeated, like in the storybooks, with a pretty dress and flowers and cake. Perhaps not quite so elaborate immediately. Eleanor smiled gently. But yes, a proper marriage. Would that make Mr. Blackwood our new papa? Sophie continued, her practical 5-year-old mind moving directly to the heart of the matter. The question Eleanor had been expecting, dreading even, had been voiced. She looked to Nathan, watching his reaction carefully. Mr. Blackwood would become your stepfather, she explained. He doesn't wish to replace your father Nathan. He's been very clear about respecting Daniel's memory and place in your lives. Nathan considered this with serious concentration. Would we have to call him Papa? No, Eleanor assured him. You could continue to call him Mr. Blackwood, or perhaps Wyatt eventually, if that feels right to you. These things take time to determine. Would we stay here at Silver Creek? Nathan pressed. Forever. Yes, Eleanor confirmed. This would become our permanent home. Nathan fell silent processing this information while Sophie bounced with growing excitement on Eleanor's lap. I think it's a wonderful idea, Sophie declared. Mr. Blackwood is nice, and he knows lots of stories, and he helped when Michael was sick, and he taught us skating, and he gave Nathan special gloves. Sophie, Eleanor interrupted gently, this is an important decision for all of us. We need to think carefully and respect each other's feelings. She turned back to Nathan, who was staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape. Nathan, what are your thoughts? The boy was quiet for a long moment, his young shoulders carrying a weight of responsibility no child should bear. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, despite the emotion beneath it. Papa would want us to be safe, he said. He always said taking care of us was his most important job. If Mr. Blackwood can do that now, and if you care for him, he turned to face Eleanor, his expression achingly mature. I think it's the right thing to do. Relief and pride washed through Eleanor in equal measure, relief that her eldest supported the decision, pride in his thoughtful reasoning and emotional maturity. She opened her arms and Nathan moved into her embrace, allowing himself the comfort of being a child despite his efforts to be the man of the family. Thank you, she whispered against his hair. Your father would be so proud of you, Nathan. As am I. A knock at the door interrupted the family moment. Wyatt stood in the doorway, his tall frame somehow less intimidating than usual, as he regarded the clustered family with careful respect. May I join you? He asked simply. Eleanor nodded and Wyatt entered, closing the door behind him to ensure their conversation remained private. He chose to sit on the small chair near the window, rather than the bed, maintaining a respectful distance while still joining their circle. I understand your mother has explained our situation. He began addressing all three children, but focusing particularly on Nathan. I want you to know that I take marriage very seriously. It's a commitment not just to your mother, but to all of you as a family. Nathan studied Wyatt with the same direct gaze Wyatt often employed, himself a similarity Eleanor had noticed before, but found particularly striking in this moment. Would you make us leave our home, change our name? The boy asked. Wyatt shook his head. Silver Creek would be your home permanently. As for names, that would be your choice when you were older. I would never force such a personal decision. What about Papa's things? His Bible and boots and pocket watch? Nathan continued testing Wyatt's commitment to honoring Daniel's memory. Those belong to your family's history, Wyatt replied without hesitation. They would be preserved and respected, just as my late wife's possessions remain part of this household's history. Nathan nodded, apparently satisfied with these answers. Sophie, less concerned with practical details, moved to a more emotional question. Do you love Mama? She asked with characteristic directness. The question might have flustered a lesser man, but Wyatt considered it with the seriousness it deserved. His gaze moved to Eleanor, holding hers as he answered. I care deeply for your mother, he said carefully. I admire her strength, her intelligence, her devotion to you children. The word love means different things to different people, but I can promise this, I will respect her, support her, and protect all of you with everything I possess. It was not a conventional declaration of romantic love, yet Eleanor found it more meaningful than flowery professions might have been. Wyatt Blackwood was not a man of easy sentiment or casual promises. His measured words carried the weight of absolute commitment, a foundation far more reliable than fleeting passion. Children, Eleanor said gently, would you give Mr. Blackwood and me a few minutes alone to discuss the details? Perhaps you could help Maria with breakfast preparations. Once the children had departed, Nathan, with a backward glance of surprising perception, Eleanor and Wyatt faced each other in the quiet room, the weight of their impending decisions settling between them. They seem accepting, Wyatt observed, though Nathan will need time to fully adjust. Yes, Eleanor agreed. He carries his father's memory as both blessing and burden. But he's a remarkable boy, already thinking of our welfare above his own comfort. Wyatt nodded, his expression softening. He reminds me of myself at that age, shouldering responsibilities beyond his years, trying to be the man his family needs. The insight revealed Wyatt's deep understanding of Nathan's position, not just intellectually, but from personal experience. It reassured Eleanor further that he would approach his role as stepfather with the sensitivity and respect Nathan required. Wyatt, she said quietly, before we proceed, I need to ask, are you certain about this decision? Not just the strategic necessity, but the personal commitment it represents. Wyatt rose and moved to stand before her closer than their usual careful distance permitted. After a moment's hesitation, he took her hands in his, the first deliberate physical contact he had initiated between them. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and steady, "when you arrived at Silver Creek, I offered shelter out of obligation and guilt. When I suggested you might stay permanently, it was because I recognized your value to the household. But now," he paused, seeming to search for words not typically in his vocabulary, "now I find the thought of you and the children leaving unbearable for reasons entirely separate from practical considerations." The simple admission, delivered without artifice or calculation, moved Eleanor deeply. Wyatt Blackwood was not a man given to emotional declarations, which made this straightforward acknowledgement all the more meaningful. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. "What began as necessity has become something else, something I wasn't seeking, but now find I cannot imagine surrendering." Wyatt's hands tightened around hers. "Then we are agreed not just as strategy, but as choice." "Yes," Eleanor replied, certainty replacing her earlier hesitation. "We are agreed." Outside the window, a cardinal flashed bright red against the snow-covered landscape, a startling splash of color in the white and gray world of winter. Eleanor took it as a sign, perhaps from Daniel, perhaps from Elizabeth, that the choice they were making carried more blessings than either of them yet realized.